They said Adrian Vale was untouchable. 3 decades of Imperial service, 47 military campaigns, a name that made enemy generals reconsider their careers. And he threw all of it into the gutter for a woman whose real name nobody knew. The court laughed first, then they went quiet. Because when a man like Adrian Vale loses his mind over someone, the wreckage doesn't stay contained to one household. It bleeds outward. It infects policy, poisons alliances, and leaves bodies in places no one expected. You want to understand how an empire nearly fell from the inside? Then stay here. Because this story doesn't start with a battle or a betrayal. It starts with a man standing in the rain outside his own front gates, choosing the wrong door, and smiling while he did it. The morning Adrian Vale walked out of Ironfield Manor for the last time, the sky looked like bruised iron. He didn't take much. A leather travel case. 3 suits. The silver ring his father had pressed into his palm on the day he received his dukedom, which he left on the entry table next to a cold cup of tea, visible to anyone who walked through the front door. A statement without words, the kind only a man who understood theater would make. His youngest son, Darren, was 14 that morning. He stood at the second-floor window and watched his father climb into a private carriage, not the ducal coach with its iron crest and matched grays, but a hired vehicle, anonymous and plain, the kind merchants used. Darren didn't call out. He'd learned, in the months prior, that calling out to his father produced nothing useful. Adrian Vale had stopped hearing certain voices. The ones that loved him had become, in some chemical process that nobody in the family fully understood, the ones he trusted least. The carriage rolled south toward the city. Darren stood at the window until it disappeared around the curve in the lane. Then he went to find his brother. Tis. Caspian Vale was 26 and had his father's jawline without his father's patience. He was in the weapons room when Darren found him. Not training exactly, but working through a series of blade forms that served the same psychological function as training. Repetition as a form of pressure management. The kind of thing you did when you needed your hands occupied so your brain didn't do something irreversible. He knew without being told. He's gone, Darren said anyway. Caspian ran through the last form, reset his stance, then drove the practice blade into the wooden post with enough force that it stuck. He left it there. How much did he take? Almost nothing. He left the ring. Something moved across Caspian's face that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage, but occupied the territory between them. A kind of exhausted disgust that had been building for 11 months and had finally found its final shape. He pulled a cloth from his belt and wiped his hands. Good, he said, which was not what he meant, and Darren was old enough to understand the difference. Caspian, don't. He walked past his brother toward the door. Get Hendrik. We have a staff meeting at 9, and I'm not rescheduling it because our father decided today was the day. Darren watched him go. The weapons room was very quiet. On the floor near the door, someone, their mother, probably, had left a folded piece of correspondence with the Vale seal pressed into the wax. Unopened. It had been there since yesterday afternoon. Darren picked it up, looked at the seal, and put it back down without opening it. Some news kept. Adrian Vale had met Celine Marrow at a diplomatic function 11 months prior in the gilded reception hall of Lord Havelock's city estate during an evening that was supposed to be about trade agreements and had instead become, for Adrian, the first moment in years he felt genuinely awake. He would tell this story differently, depending on who was asking. To the few friends he still confided in during those early months, he described it as recognition, the sensation of looking at someone and understanding, without rational basis, that you'd been waiting for that specific conversation your entire adult life. To himself, in the honest hours before sleep, he admitted something closer to the truth, that he had been profoundly, dangerously bored for at least a decade, and that Celine Marrow had arrived at the exact moment when boredom had made him stupid. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way court women were trained to be. She didn't perform warmth. She sat at the edge of the reception hall's second tier with a glass of wine she barely touched, and watched the room with the particular quality of attention that made everyone she looked at feel simultaneously assessed and interesting. She had dark hair that she wore simply, no elaborate arrangement, no ornamental combs, which was itself a statement in a room full of women who'd spent 3 hours with their ladies' maids. She had gray eyes that operated at a frequency that felt slightly outside the normal human register, too still, too calibrated, like a clock that kept perfect time in a way that made you wonder what was actually running the mechanism. Adrian had been working the room with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd attended several hundred functions of this type and had developed a system for extracting maximum political utility in minimum time. He spoke to Harwick about the grain levy. He reassured Countess Pelham about her son's regimental posting. He told 3 separate jokes at 3 separate intervals, each calibrated to its audience, each landing correctly. He was performing, in the technical sense, executing a version of himself that served specific social functions. And he was doing it flawlessly, which was part of why he was bored. Then Celine Marrow said, from 3 feet behind him, "You do that like a man who stopped finding it interesting about 6 years ago." He turned. She was looking at him with an expression that was not quite a smile. The corners of her mouth hadn't moved, but something in the arrangement of her face communicated amusement, or its more sophisticated cousin, which was recognition. "I beg your pardon," he said, which was reflex, not offense. "The room working. The calibrated charm. You're very good at it. You're just not in it anymore." She tilted her head slightly. "I've been watching you for 20 minutes. You've told different versions of the same joke to 3 different men, and each one thought you were being spontaneous. That's actually impressive. It's just—" She paused. "You look like a man running an excellent machine that he built a long time ago and doesn't particularly need to operate manually anymore." Adrian Vale had not been spoken to like this in a very long time. Not since his early years, when he was still building the machine in question, and people felt more licensed to tell him uncomfortable things. Power, he had learned, was an excellent insulator against honesty. People stopped saying the true thing to your face when the consequences of your displeasure became sufficiently significant. This woman had apparently not received that information. "And you," he said, "spend diplomatic receptions cataloging the performance patterns of strangers?" "Only the interesting ones." She turned back toward the room below. "The uninteresting ones aren't catalogable. They're just noise." He should have moved on. That was the correct social read. Match her detachment, acknowledge the exchange as an amusing interlude, extract himself with grace, continue the room. He had the tools for it. He'd done it 100 times. Instead, he said, "What else did you notice?" And she told him. For 40 minutes, Celine Marrow dismantled every performance in that room with the quiet, systematic precision of someone who'd been trained to do exactly this, though Adrian didn't understand the nature of that training until much later. She read people the way surveyors read terrain, not with hostility, not with contempt, but with a professional accuracy that stripped the social theater away and left the actual human being standing in the rubble. She was often right. She was occasionally devastating. And she delivered all of it with a quality of intimacy that felt, to a man who had not been genuinely spoken to in years, like water. He went home to his wife that night with Celine Marrow's card in his breast pocket, pressing against his ribs. He told himself it was nothing. He was wrong in the way that only very intelligent people manage to be wrong, completely, architecturally, from the foundation up. His wife, Ivana, had known before Adrian did. Ivana Vale was 51, the daughter of a military commander, raised in a household that treated sentiment as a liability and competence as the only currency worth accumulating. She had married Adrian when she was 23 and he was 27, in a match that was strategically sound on both sides, and had, over time, developed into something that neither of them would have described as love in the lyric sense, but which functioned with the reliability of a well-maintained bridge. You crossed it daily without thinking about it, and its absence would have been catastrophic. She had noticed the change in him around the 3rd week after Havelock's function. Not the affair. That came later. The change. The way he'd come to the breakfast table with something different in his eyes, a kind of restlessness that hadn't been there before, or rather had been there always but dormant, like an old wound that had been living quietly for years and had now, for some reason, begun to ache again. She did not ask. This was strategic, not cowardly. Ivana Vale had learned that asking certain questions prematurely sealed the door on all subsequent information. She waited. She watched. She made note of what she saw without drawing conclusions before she had enough data. By the second month, she had enough data. She waited another 3 weeks before she said anything, in the private library after supper on a Tuesday, when the house was quiet and the two of them were as alone as they ever were anymore. "I think," she said from her chair by the window, "that we need to talk about what's happening." Adrian looked up from his correspondence. "I'm not certain what you mean." "Yes, you are," she said. Not accusatory, factual, the way she named most things. The silence between them had weight. "Her name is Celine Marrow," Ivana continued when it became clear he wasn't going to fill the silence. "She arrived in the capital approximately 14 months ago. Her documented history before that is thin in ways that should interest you professionally, even if they don't currently interest you personally. She has connections in 3 foreign trade delegations and no apparent income source commensurate with how she lives." Adrian's jaw had tightened. "You've been having me followed. I've been gathering information that was affecting my household. That's different from following you." She set down her book. "Adrian, I'm not speaking to you as your wife right now. I'm speaking to you as someone who has been at your side through 30 years of political navigation and who is telling you that this woman is not what she appears to be. You don't know anything about her. I know what her documented history doesn't include, which is more useful." He stood. That was always his tell. He'd always been a man who processed discomfort through movement. This conversation isn't, "Sit down." It was quiet. Firm. The voice she used for situations that didn't leave room for theater. "I'm not asking you to end it. I'm asking you to open your eyes. There's a difference." He sat, slowly, like a man making a concession under protest. "She's the first person in years who treats me like a person," he said. It came out rougher than he intended, ragged at the edges, the way truth sounds when it's been sitting compressed for too long. "Not the Duke, not the function. Me. You don't know what that's like." Ivana was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful in a way that cost her something. "I used to," she said. Adrian looked at her. Neither of them said anything else for a long time. He left the library. He did not go to his own rooms. The months that followed had the quality of watching a structural failure in slow motion, the kind of thing where you can see the load-bearing elements compromising one by one and understand exactly where it's going but cannot seem to intervene at the speed the situation requires. Adrian moved into a private residence in the city's upper quarter by the 4th month. He framed it publicly as a logistical convenience. His city responsibilities had become demanding enough to justify a closer base of operations. And this framing held for approximately 3 weeks before the court's information infrastructure updated itself and everyone knew what was actually happening. The court's response was interesting, not uniform. A segment of the older nobility responded with the kind of disapproval that is structurally indistinguishable from satisfaction. They had always found Adrian Vale's competence and influence slightly oppressive, and his public unraveling provided a certain relief, the sensation of watching a very tall man discover he was not, after all, invulnerable to gravity. This group said very little openly and worked very hard behind closed doors. Another segment watched with the particular attention of people calculating impact, not scandalized, not delighted, but quietly assessing the redistribution of influence that a weakened Adrian Vale would create, and positioning themselves accordingly. These were the dangerous ones. They would not attack directly. They would simply occupy the space left vacant. A third group, smaller, said nothing publicly and burned with private fury. The ones who owed Adrian Vale concrete debts, whose careers and sometimes whose lives had depended on his patronage and protection, and who understood that his deterioration was not a personal matter, but an institutional crisis that would have real consequences in the physical world. Caspian Vale belonged to this third group, though he would have rejected the framing. He didn't think of himself as invested in his father for strategic reasons. He thought of himself as furious for honest ones. But the practical result was the same. He spent those months doing his father's work while his father was otherwise occupied. And he did it with a quality of controlled anger that was, in its own way, impressive. He was good at it. Better, possibly, than he'd understood before circumstance forced the demonstration. This did not make him less angry. If anything, it made him angrier. The discovery that he was capable of covering for someone who had not earned the coverage. "Tell me something," Celine said. They were in the private residence. Late afternoon light came through the high windows of the main room in long, flat angles, cutting across the floor in a way that made the space look staged, like a painting of the idea of a room rather than an actual one. Adrian was at the window. Celine was on the couch with her legs tucked beneath her, a position she occupied with the easy authority of someone who decided very early on where she was comfortable and arranged the world to accommodate it. "What do you want to know?" "Caspian." She said the name the way she said most things, with precision, no warmth added for social lubrication. "Tell me how he thinks." Adrian turned from the window. "Why?" "Because he's going to be a problem eventually, and I'd rather understand the problem before it becomes immediate." She picked up her wine. "He's not like you. You operate from pride, which makes you predictable in useful ways. He operates from something colder. I want to know what it is." There was a moment where Adrian might have asked a different question, where something in the phrasing, its clinical quality, its strategic implication, might have registered as data worth examining. Instead, he said, "He operates from obligation. He was raised to believe that service and loyalty were the same thing, and he's never successfully separated them. It makes him reliable and inflexible in equal measure." Celine nodded slowly. "Inflexible how?" "He doesn't renegotiate positions once he's formed them. He'll tell you exactly what he thinks once, and after that he'll either be with you or against you, and there's no conversation that changes the calculus." Adrian turned back to the window. "He's already against me." She sipped her wine. "And the household's military contacts. Who does he use for private communications?" Adrian answered. He didn't notice he was doing it. This was Celine Marrow's primary instrument. The question that followed the question, each one slightly further from the emotional core of the conversation, delivered at a pace slow enough that the subject's defensive awareness didn't trigger. It required patience and precision calibration and a fundamental understanding of how human attention worked. What it noticed, and more importantly, what it didn't. She had been doing it for 8 months. She had accumulated, across those 8 months, a volume of information that would have horrified Adrian Vale if he had seen it assembled in a single place. He had not seen it assembled in a single place. Quasi. The first concrete sign came in the 7th month. Not to Adrian, who would not have recognized it as such, but to Caspian, who received a report from the commander of the Vale household's northern regimental liaison that a convoy of military correspondents had been ambushed between Ironfield and the capital. 3 guards dead. The correspondence taken. Caspian read the report twice. Then he called Hendrik, who was the household's administrative director and had been since before Caspian was born. A gray man in his mid-60s who operated with the low-profile competence of someone who understood that the most important people in any institution were often the ones nobody thought to photograph. "Who knew the convoy's route?" Caspian asked. Hendrik set down his pen. 4 people inside this house. Myself, Captain Wren, your mother, and—" He paused. "Your father, who was briefed last week through the standard channels." Caspian was very still. "And outside the house?" "No one with this level of operational detail. The regional commanders knew the general schedule, not the specific route or timing." Caspian put the report face down on the desk. "I need you, he said, to start logging every piece of operational information that leaves this house. Where it goes, in what form, and who has access to it at each stage." Hendrik looked at him for a moment. "That's going to implicate—" "I know what it's going to implicate. Do it anyway." Hendrik nodded once and left. Caspian sat alone in the administrative office. His father's office, technically, though his father hadn't occupied it in 4 months, and looked at the paneled wall opposite, where a map of the Empire's northern territories hung in a dark wood frame. He'd looked at that map his entire childhood. His father had stood in front of it 1,000 times, using a wooden pointer to explain troop movements and supply chains, and the cold mathematics of defending a territory that didn't want to be easily defended. He thought about the convoy. 3 guards dead. He thought about his father, in a city residence with a woman whose documentation was thin in ways that professional attention would find interesting. He picked up the report and filed it. Ivana received him that evening in the Manor's East sitting room, which she'd claimed as her working space after Adrian left. A practical reorganization of territory that she had undertaken without announcement and which Caspian had understood instinctively. He told her about the convoy. She listened without interrupting, which was her habit, the quality of attention she gave things that mattered. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You think the root information came from your father?" "I think it's the most probable explanation. I'm not drawing conclusions yet." "No." She looked at the fire. "You're being more careful than the evidence requires." "Which is correct. But you're also angry, and that's going to make the carefulness cost you more effort than it should." She paused. "I'm angry too. I want you to know that I'm doing the same work." Caspian looked at his mother. The particular way you look at someone when you realize, slightly later than you should have, that they've been carrying a weight you hadn't fully accounted for. Ivana Vale had maintained herself through this with a quality of composure that he recognized now, been unconsciously relying on without fully acknowledging. The house ran. The staff remained functional. The political relationships that Adrian had been neglecting were being quietly maintained through Ivana's network of correspondence and careful social management. She was holding the entire structure up with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd been doing it long enough that nobody remembered it as effort. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not for any specific thing, for the general situation." "Don't apologize to me," she said. "Work." He nodded. "I need access to Father's correspondence archives. Everything from the past 8 months. I need to know what he shared, and with whom." Ivana was quiet for a moment. "Some of that correspondence may be personal." "Yes." Another silence. "Do what you need to do," she said finally. The words cost her something. He could see it in the set of her jaw. "But do it correctly. I won't have this house torn apart by accusations we can't substantiate." "I know how to do this." "I know you do." She looked back at the fire. "That's the only reason I'm not doing it myself." He went to see his father 3 days later. The city residence was on a quiet street in the upper quarter, the kind of building that announced prosperity without announcing itself. Good materials, understated facade, the sort of place that cost enough that nobody had to ask the question. Caspian arrived in the early evening without sending word ahead, which was deliberate. A servant answered, young, unfamiliar, not from the Vale household roster. "Tell the Duke his son is here," Caspian said. He waited in a front room that had been furnished with a taste that wasn't his father's. Cleaner lines than Adrian preferred, cooler colors, the kind of deliberate aesthetic neutrality that felt, to Caspian's eye, like someone had made careful decisions about how the space should feel without leaving fingerprints on those decisions. Nothing about this room looked like Adrian Vale. It looked like the room where you'd hold a meeting you didn't want witnesses to. Adrian came in after 7 minutes. He looked well. That was the first thing Caspian clocked, and it produced an unpleasant sensation that he categorized and set aside. His father was well-rested, well-dressed, carrying himself with something that looked superficially like ease, but which Caspian, who had been watching this man for 26 years, recognized as a particular kind of controlled energy, the kind that came from being actively engaged in something that felt important, the kind that looked like happiness from certain angles. Caspian. A pause. The kind that contained multiple things simultaneously. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know. Sit down." "I'd rather stand." Caspian looked at his father directly. "A convoy was ambushed 11 days ago. 3 men died. The correspondence they were carrying included operational details about the northern garrison supply routes. That information was distributed through standard channels to a list of 6 people. You were one of them." The silence had texture. Adrian's expression did not collapse. He was too experienced for that, too long trained in the kind of emotional management that 30 years of political navigation required. But something shifted underneath it, a recalibration. "You're suggesting I leaked military correspondence." "I'm telling you what happened and what the distribution list looked like. I'm not suggesting anything yet. Yet. Adrian repeated the word with a quality that was close to contempt. Not quite. The fraction of distance it maintained from contempt was the part that was still, despite everything, his son's father. You came here to tell me I'm a security risk. I came here to tell you 3 men are dead, and the most probable explanation for how that happened involves information that passed through you. Or through any of the other 5 people on that list. Yes, I'm visiting all of them. A beat. I came here first. Something moved in Adrian's face at that. A complex, rapid thing that Caspian couldn't fully decode. His father looked away, toward the window, the same tell his father had always had. This isn't what you think it is, Adrian said, quiet. What do I think it is? You think Celine is... He stopped, restarted. You've decided she's dangerous. You've decided that before you had any evidence, because you wanted a reason, and now you're building evidence toward a conclusion you already reached. Caspian didn't move. 3 men are dead, he said again. Simply, like a fixed coordinate. People die in military operations. That's not new. Not from ambushes using information that could only have come from inside our house. You don't know that. Adrian turned back from the window. His voice had an edge in it now. The sharpening that happened when he felt cornered, which was not frequent, and which Caspian had always known to be a warning sign. You're running a preliminary investigation, and you're already here, in my house, treating me like a suspect. Because it's easier than admitting that the real reason you're here is that you want me to come home. Caspian was quiet for a moment. I want you to come home, he said. No inflection. And I want 3 dead men to have died for reasons that don't connect to information you were briefed on. Right now I'm dealing with the second problem because it's the one I can do something about. The silence between them was the kind that exists between 2 people who understand each other extremely well and are currently watching that understanding produce nothing useful. I didn't leak anything, Adrian said. His voice was flat, certain, the voice he used for things he believed absolutely. Then help me find who did. A long pause. I'll give you whatever you need from my end, Adrian said finally, but I want you to understand something. He looked at his son directly, the full force of it, the version of his attention that had, in Caspian's childhood, been the most significant thing in his world. What I have here, this life, you don't get to use an investigation to take that apart. That's not what this is for. 3 men are dead, Caspian said for the 3rd and final time. He left without waiting for a response. He was on the street outside, in the cooling evening air, when the door behind him opened again. Not his father. Celine Marrow stood in the doorway. She was exactly as described. The dark hair, the still quality, the gray eyes that operated at a frequency slightly outside what he'd expected from his mother's account. She looked at him without expression, which was itself a kind of expression. He'll help you, she said. Her voice was even, controlled. The kind of voice that had been placed very deliberately in its register. He wants to. He just needs to feel like it was his decision. Caspian looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. That's why I said what I said. Something shifted in her face. Brief, rapidly controlled, but not fully controlled. A micro-adjustment. The kind that happened when someone had expected one thing and encountered another. You're less like him than I expected, she said. Everyone says that. He held her gaze. Who are you, exactly? It was not phrased as a question. A woman your father loves, she said. That's not what I asked. She smiled at him. It was technically a smile. The arrangement of facial muscles was correct. But it had the quality of a tool being deployed rather than a response being produced. He clocked it, filed it, did not react to it. Good night, she said, and stepped back inside. The door closed. Caspian stood on the street for 3 seconds, looking at the closed door. Then he walked to his horse, mounted, and rode back toward Ironfield. The whole exchange had taken 9 seconds. It had told him 3 things he hadn't known before. She had been listening to the entire conversation from somewhere in that house. She had come to the door because she wanted to assess him, not to reassure him. And when she smiled, it hadn't reached her eyes in the way that genuine amusement did. It had reached her eyes in the way that calculation did, which was a different thing entirely, and which a less careful observer might not have been able to distinguish. He rode back through the city with the quiet, focused momentum of a man who has confirmed a hypothesis and is now moving to the next phase. The letter arrived at Ironfield 6 days later. It came in an unmarked envelope delivered through a circuitous route that Hendrik traced back through 3 separate courier hands before losing the thread in the capital's eastern docks. The contents were briefs. 2 paragraphs, no signature, written in a hand that showed evidence of deliberate modification to obscure its natural character, the kind of thing a trained person did, the kind of thing that required training to recognize. Caspian read it twice. Then he locked it in the secure correspondence drawer and sent for his mother. Ivana read it once. She set it down on the table between them. "Someone else knows," she said. "Someone else has known for longer than we have, and they want us aware of it. Why? Either they can't act directly and they need us to move, or they're positioning themselves to benefit from what happens when we do move, and they want to ensure that what happens aligns with their interests." He looked at the letter. "Neither option is comfortable." "No." Ivana was quiet. "What does it say specifically about Celine Marrow?" "It says she's not from the Western provinces. It says her documented history was constructed. And it says," Caspian paused, "that we're not the first house she's been positioned in, that there was another 3 years ago, a regional lord named Caruth who made a series of strategic errors that benefited a foreign trade faction and lost his eastern territories. His household was disrupted approximately 14 months before those errors occurred." He looked at his mother. "The timing matches." Ivana was very still. "Your father," she said, not as a question. "He's been briefed on the northern supply routes, the eastern garrison rotation schedule, and the Crown's private arbitration strategy on the Harwick grain dispute." Caspian laid it out flat, the way he named things that needed to be named cleanly before they could be dealt with. "All 3 of those are things that would be of significant operational interest to an external party trying to understand where to apply pressure." The sitting room was very quiet. The fire had burned low. "He won't believe you," Ivana said. "I know. He'll say you're using this to separate them. He'll say the investigation is manufactured." "I know. So what do you do?" Caspian looked at the letter. "I find the proof that doesn't require him to believe me. That speaks for itself, regardless of what he wants to believe." He looked up. "And I find it before whoever sent this letter decides we're not moving fast enough and tries to accelerate things in a direction we can't control." Ivana nodded once. Outside, the wind had picked up. The windows of the old manor rattled in their frames. The particular sound that Ironfield made in autumn, when the weather came in from the north, and the building responded with its accumulated complaint of old stone and older timber. Caspian had heard that sound his entire life. It had always seemed to him like the house speaking its age, the sound of a structure that had absorbed centuries of weather and was reporting, neutrally, on what it had endured. He folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket. "I need 2 weeks," he said. "You have them." He left. Enchant. On the 14th night, Caspian Vale sat in a dim room in the capital's documentary district, a cramped, overheated space above a cartographer's shop that smelled of ink and old wood, across a table from a woman named Voss, who worked for the Imperial Intelligence Office and owed him a favor of sufficient weight that she had agreed, with some reluctance, to run a background query through channels he didn't have access to. She slid a folder across the table. "Celine Marrow doesn't exist," she said. Caspian looked at the folder without opening it. "Explain." "The name appears in documented records starting 6 years ago. Everything before that is either missing or constructed. The construction is good, better than most, which means whoever did it was working with resources and time, not improvising. But it has the tells that constructed histories always have, if you know what you're looking for." Voss poured herself a drink. "The woman using that name, she's real. She's skilled. She's been operating under various identities for at least a decade in the intel community's peripheral awareness, which means she's good enough that we've only ever caught the shadow, not the substance." Caspian opened the folder. Inside was a partial dossier, 3 pages. Several things were redacted with heavy black bars that told him the intelligence office had more than it was sharing. "Who does she work for?" he asked. Voss was quiet for a moment. "That," she said carefully, "is the question that makes this conversation end." Caspian looked up. "That bad? That complicated?" She finished her drink. "What I can tell you, off the record and with no documentation, is that the pattern of operations associated with this person's shadow history aligns with a foreign intelligence apparatus that has been running a long-term destabilization program targeting the Empire's noble houses. Not a crude operation, patient, architectural, the kind that takes years to set up and produces results that look, from the outside, like a series of unfortunate coincidences." The room was very still. "Your father," Voss said. "Yes." "How much has he shared?" "Enough? Possibly more than enough." Caspian closed the folder. "I need to get to him before she understands that we're this close." "She may already understand." "Then I need to move tonight." He stood. Voss looked at him with the expression of someone who was calculating, rapidly and without visible computation, the likely consequences of what she'd just enabled. "Vale," she said. He stopped. "If this goes badly, if she understands that the intelligence office was involved in flagging her, it creates an exposure I can't contain. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "I understand." He picked up the folder. "I'll keep you out of it." "That's not a guarantee you can make." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He left. Outside, the capital moved with its nighttime rhythm. Carts and foot traffic, and the warm light from restaurant windows, and the distant sound of someone in an upper floor playing a stringed instrument with more enthusiasm than precision. Caspian walked through it with his hand on the folder inside his coat, and his mind 3 steps ahead of where his feet were taking him. He was halfway to the upper quarter when his fastest courier intercepted him at the corner of Brass Street and Market Lane. A young man running hard, breathing in the specific pattern of someone who'd been running for longer than his body was happy about. He pressed a note into Caspian's hand. Caspian read it under the nearest lamp. 3 sentences. His father had called an emergency council of Adrian's closest allies for the following morning. A closed session, private residence, Celine Marrow in attendance. The purpose listed was a strategic briefing on the Vale household's military positioning. The information to be disclosed included the revised northern garrison rotation and the Crown's private position on the eastern border dispute. The Crown's private position on the eastern border dispute was information that had been communicated to Adrian Vale in a sealed document 6 days ago. Classified at the highest level of the Imperial diplomatic apparatus. If that information left that room, the consequences would be... Caspian stopped his mind before it finished the sentence, because finishing the sentence required committing to an assessment he wasn't ready to commit to while standing on a street corner in the dark. He looked at the courier. "Is this confirmed?" "I had it from Hendrik directly, sir. He found the meeting notice on the private correspondence desk this evening." Caspian folded the note. He stood in the lamplight for 3 seconds. Then he turned north and began walking at a pace that was not quite running, but communicated everything that running would have communicated, without the visibility. The meeting was in 9 hours. He had to reach his father before morning, before the assembled allies arrived, before Celine Marrow sat in that room and listened to Adrian Vale hand her the one piece of information that could... His mind stopped again. Because it had just registered something that it had been processing below conscious threshold since he'd read the note. The courier said Hendrik found the meeting notice on the private correspondence desk. Hendrik had been with the Vale household for 31 years. He ran the administrative infrastructure with a precision that bordered on institutional memory. He knew where every document lived, every protocol existed, every piece of correspondence was supposed to be. Hendrik had not mentioned this meeting to Caspian during their morning briefing 6 hours ago, which meant Hendrik had found the note after that briefing. Or Hendrik had found the note before the briefing and chosen not to mention it. Caspian stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the lamp-lit street, the city moving around him, and held very still while his mind ran through the full implications of that discrepancy. The 31-year tenure. The institutional access. The quiet, total invisibility of a man who had been in the perfect position to observe, record, and transmit the household's operational details for how long? How long exactly? How many years before Celine Merrow's arrival had this been running? His mouth went dry. He turned, not north toward his father's residence, south toward Ironfield, toward his mother, who was alone in the manor tonight with a staff that included Hendrik. He was already running. He ran. Not the controlled movement of a man executing a plan, the raw, adrenaline-stripped sprint of a man who has just understood that the ground beneath everything he thought he knew has been hollow for longer than he can calculate. Caspian Vale covered the distance from Brass Street to where his horse was stabled in 4 minutes, mounted without slowing, and drove north out of the capital's upper quarter toward the Ironfield Road with the particular focus of a person who has collapsed all variables into a single immediate priority. His mother was alone. With Hendrik. The thought kept reassembling itself in his chest with a physical quality, like a hand pressing against his sternum from the inside. 31 years. The number moved through him the way disorienting numbers do. Not processed cleanly, not filed, just present, radiating its implications outward into every memory that suddenly needed to be re-examined. Every piece of information that had ever left Ironfield, every document that had passed through the administrative system, every operational briefing that Hendrik had quietly, efficiently organized, every corridor Hendrik walked daily, unremarked upon, invisible the way long-tenure staff always become invisible, part of the building's infrastructure rather than its population. How long before Celine arrived had Hendrik been feeding someone? How much of what Caspian thought he understood about the household's security had been constructed on a foundation that was already compromised before he was old enough to walk those corridors? He didn't let himself finish that calculation. Not yet. Not while riding. He rode. Ironfield at midnight had its own specific silence. Not peaceful, but weighted. The quiet of a structure that had been absorbing the temperature of the people inside it for long enough that the walls held mood the way stone holds cold. Caspian came through the east gate at a pace that brought the overnight guard out of his station with his hand on his sidearm. Easy. Caspian dismounted. Where's Hendrik? The guard, a young man named Pert, who had been on household staff for 3 years and had never once seen Caspian Vale arrive like this, looked briefly uncertain. His quarters, sir. Last I saw him at shift change, around 10. And Lady Vale? In the east wing. She asked not to be disturbed. Caspian handed off the reins and moved inside. He did not go to Hendrik's quarters first. He went to his mother. Ivana was not asleep. She was at her writing desk with 2 candles lit and correspondence arranged in her particular system of priority. Urgent left, pending center, reference right. And she looked up when Caspian came through the door with the expression of a woman who had been expecting something, though perhaps not this specific version of it. Sit, she said. I need to tell you something. I can see that. Sit down first. You're breathing like you ran from the city. He sat, forced his breathing to slow. The discipline of it was physical work. I think Hendrik has been compromised, he said. Flat, clean, no runway. Ivana's pen stopped moving. The 2 candles on the desk threw shadows that shifted in the draft from the door Caspian had left open. She looked at him across the desk with an expression that moved through several phases very rapidly. Initial resistance, processing, reassessment, and came to rest in something that was not surprise exactly, or not entirely. Tell me why, she said. He told her. The courier's message, the timing discrepancy, the 31-year tenure and the scope of access it represented, the way the convoy ambush had required routing information that couldn't have come from outside the administrative core. Ivana listened without moving. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. The grain convoy 2 years ago, she said finally. The one that was delayed by 3 days and arrived short by 40 crates. We attributed it to the northern road conditions. Caspian looked at her. And the correspondence from Lord Aldrich last spring, she continued. The private one, about the Eastern arbitration terms. Aldrich told me later that the counterparty seemed to know the Vale position before the meeting convened. We couldn't trace how. She looked at the fire. I filed it as a leak from Aldrich's side. It wasn't. No. She picked up her pen and then set it down again. How long? I don't know yet. Best estimate. Caspian thought about it honestly, which required ignoring the part of him that wanted the answer to be smaller than the evidence suggested. 5 years. Possibly more. The fire crackled. Ivana Vale sat very still with the particular stillness of a woman who has built her adult life on the assumption that the people inside her house were the fixed points, the things that didn't move, and has just been required to remove one of them from that category. What do you need? She said. They moved carefully. This was not a situation that rewarded speed over precision. Speed here meant alerting Hendrik before they had enough to contain the situation completely. Caspian laid it out in the next 40 minutes. Who was awake in the house? What posts needed to be quietly shifted? How to isolate the administrative records without making the isolation visible. Ivana handled the staff. She was better at this than Caspian. She had 30 years of managing a large household social architecture, and she understood how to move people without making the movement look intentional. By 1 in the morning, there were 3 additional men near Hendrik's corridor who appeared, to any casual observer, to be doing routine overnight checks. Caspian went to the records room. It was unlocked. It was always unlocked. Hendrik had argued convincingly years ago that locking it created more security problems than it solved, since locked doors generated curiosity and foot traffic. This argument, Caspian now understood, had other dimensions. He worked by single candle, methodical, moving through the correspondence logs with the kind of attention that required setting aside everything except the patterns. Discrepancies in filing dates, documents that had been accessed and refiled in slightly different orientations, the kind of thing you only noticed if you'd spent enough time with how a particular person organized physical materials to recognize when something had been touched and replaced. Gaps in the request ledger that didn't correspond to the activity records for the same periods. He worked for 90 minutes. By the end, he had 7 specific instances across 4 years that he could document cleanly. He suspected there were 3 times that many that he couldn't. The 7 were enough. He locked the records room from the outside, a key he had and Hendrik didn't know he had, and went to find his mother. It's enough, he said. She nodded once. Do it now, before morning. Shut up. Hendrik answered his door in the gray pre-dawn, dressed quickly in the way of a man who had been awake, not roused from sleep. Caspian noticed, filed it. Sir? Hendrik's face arranged itself into its customary expression, the attentive, slightly solicitous composure of a man who'd spent decades being useful to powerful people. Up close, in poor light, he looked older than Caspian had been accounting for. Is something wrong? Come with me. Hendrik came. They went to the administrative office, his father's office, the room with the Northern Territory map on the wall. Caspian put the 7 documented discrepancies on the desk in front of Hendrik and stepped back and crossed his arms and watched. Hendrik looked at the documents. His face did not change immediately. That was interesting. The initial absence of reaction was itself a reaction, the kind that required training to produce. Innocence would have generated confusion first. This generated stillness, which was different. I'm not certain what these are meant to... Stop. Caspian kept his voice level. I've been doing this for 4 years, and I know what a person looks like when they're going to say they don't know what they're looking at. You know exactly what these are. Hendrik looked up. For a moment, something in the administrative mask slipped. Not far, not dramatically. Just enough to show what was underneath, which was not the thing Caspian had feared most, which would have been calculation or contempt. What was underneath was something older and more tired, which was in its own way worse. How long have you known? Hendrik said. Long enough. A silence. The fire in this room had been lit. Someone had banked it before midnight, the usual overnight maintenance, and it threw orange light across the desk and the documents and Hendrik's face, which had settled into something Caspian couldn't fully categorize. Not quite resignation. Something more active than that, but oriented inward. Who are you feeding? Caspian said. Hendrik was quiet. I can establish most of it from the records without your help. What your cooperation gets you is a version of what comes next that preserves certain things. Your family, for instance. You have a daughter in the Northern District. Something moved in Hendrik's face at that. The first involuntary response. Caspian had not known he had a daughter. Specifically, Voss had mentioned the leverage point in passing, a family member in the provinces, but the movement confirmed it precisely enough. Don't, Hendrik said, quiet, controlled, but with an undercurrent that hadn't been in his voice before. I'm not threatening her. I'm telling you that what happens to the people connected to you is influenced by what you tell me right now. Caspian leaned forward, both hands on the desk. Who are you feeding? Another silence. Then Hendrik said a name. It was not a name Caspian recognized. It was a title, Osts, a position, not a person. And the position it described was inside the Imperial administrative apparatus at a level that made Caspian's mind go very quiet and very cold simultaneously. How long? Caspian said. 8 years. The fire crackled. 8 years. Caspian ran it backward. 8 years before today was before Celine Marrow, before Adrian's deterioration, before any of what the family had spent the last year treating as the originating crisis. 8 years meant the deterioration wasn't the cause. It was a tool, a symptom of something that had been running underneath their lives for almost a decade, patient and structural, while the Vale household went about its business and Hendrik went about his, and the information moved outward through channels nobody thought to check because nobody thought to question the man who had been there longer than most of them had been alive. Caspian straightened. You're going to write down everything, he said. Names, dates, method of transmission, every piece of information you passed, and every instruction you received. All of it. You're going to do it now, in this room, and you're not going to stop until it's complete. He looked at the older man directly. And then we're going to have a different conversation about what comes next. But that conversation requires this one to be finished first. Hendrik looked at him for a long moment. You're more like your mother than your father, he said. I know. Caspian pushed paper and ink across the desk. Right. Dawn came in through the east-facing windows while Hendrik wrote. Caspian sat across the room and read Voss's partial dossier again in the growing light, looking for the intersections between what he'd already known and what the next several hours were going to require. There were several. The name Hendrik had given him, the position inside the Imperial apparatus, changed the geometry of the situation in ways that were going to require careful handling because it meant this wasn't containable within the Vale household alone. It touched the court. It touched the Crown's administrative structure at a level that implicated people with far more institutional protection than an aging household administrator. He thought about his father, asleep in the city residence. He thought about the meeting planned for morning, 9 hours from now 6, where Adrian was going to brief his closest allies on the Crown's private eastern border position while Celine Marrow sat in the room. He thought about the way she had smiled at him on that doorstep 9 days ago, the tooled quality of it. He thought about 8 years. His father had been a mechanism, not the cause of anything, but a delivery system, a man of sufficient access and sufficient vulnerability, and someone, somewhere, had spent years constructing the vulnerability before deploying the delivery system. Celine Marrow had not walked into a house and found a susceptible duke. She had walked into a house that had been prepared for her arrival. The thought produced a physical sensation in his chest that was not quite grief and not quite rage, something more precise than either. The sensation of understanding at full resolution that the battle you thought you were fighting was not the battle that was actually occurring. He looked at Hendrik, writing steadily at the desk. What changed when you understood that the ground was hollow, that the fixed points had been moved while you weren't looking? What kind of person did you have to become to function inside that understanding without being destroyed by it? You became the kind of person who sat in a room at dawn and watched an old man write his confession and thought 2 moves ahead and 3 moves ahead simultaneously, and felt the loss of whatever simpler version of yourself had existed before this particular night, and kept working anyway. Because the work was the only thing that held. You let the anger exist without giving it the wheel. You moved. At 6 in the morning, with Hendrik's written account complete and secured, Caspian rode back into the capital. He went first to Voss, who answered her door with the expression of someone who had also not slept and had been expecting this. "The name Hendrik gave me," Caspian said, inside, with the door closed. "Harwick." Voss went still. "Deputy Chancellor Harwick," Caspian said. The silence had an architecture. "Where did you—" Voss stopped herself, reassembled. "How good is your documentation?" 8 years of specific instances in the source's own handwriting with dates and transmission methods. He looked at her. "How good does it need to be?" Voss turned away from him and stood at her window with her arms crossed, and the particular body language of someone doing rapid structural calculations about what this information meant for her specifically. She worked for the Imperial Intelligence Office. Deputy Chancellor Harwick was positioned 3 levels above the director of the Imperial Intelligence Office. The implications of what Caspian was telling her cascaded upward through her institutional architecture in ways that required a different kind of courage than the work she normally did. "You're asking me to move on a sitting deputy chancellor," she said. "Not a question. I'm asking you to do your job. My job has a ceiling. Your job ceiling just became relevant. I know that's uncomfortable." He kept his voice even. "I also know that if this stays buried because Harwick is too protected to touch, the next thing that comes out of that spy network will make what's already happened look like a preliminary exercise." Voss didn't move for a long moment. Then she turned back. "I need a copy of that confession. You'll have it within the hour. And Vale?" She stopped. "What?" "The meeting your father has this morning, the Eastern Border briefing." She looked at him directly. "If Celine Marrow is in that room when he delivers that information, it leaves the country inside 12 hours. There are protocols for the Eastern Border position that we cannot recover from if that information goes public before the summit." Caspian felt the weight of the morning settle on him with the physical specificity of something real. "I know," he said. "So you have—" She looked at the window, calculating. "Approximately 3 hours. 2.5. Then you need to go." He was already at the door. "I'll sit." The city residence was quiet at 6:30. The servant who answered was a different one from before, younger, with the particular alertness of someone who'd been given instructions about who to admit and who to redirect. He looked at Caspian with the uncertain authority of a man who knew his instructions didn't quite account for this specific situation. "I need to see my father," Caspian said. "Now. Tell him it cannot wait." "Sir, the Duke left instructions." "Tell him his son has documentation that changes everything about this morning. He'll know what that means." Caspian held the servant's gaze without aggression, without theater, just the flat, certain pressure of a man who has nothing left to spend on social management. "Go." The servant went. Adrian came out of the back rooms in 4 minutes, dressed but carrying his jacket, which told Caspian he had been getting ready for the day rather than sleeping. The look on his face when he came through the door was the look of a man who had prepared 3 different versions of this conversation and wasn't certain which one he was going to need. "Caspian, cancel the meeting." Adrian stopped. "I beg your— the morning briefing. Cancel it. Don't send word that you're postponing. Cancel it entirely. Tell your allies there's been a complication and you'll contact them individually." He looked at his father directly. "You cannot have Celine Marrow in a room where you discuss the Eastern Border position. I need you to trust me on that for the next 40 minutes, and then I'm going to tell you everything, and after that you can make whatever decision you want." Adrian Vale looked at his son. In 30 years of being Adrian Vale, he had learned to read rooms, the specific temperature of a space when something real was at stake versus when someone was performing urgency for other reasons. He had also, in the last 11 months, made a systematic practice of discounting his son's assessments, which had required a specific kind of cognitive labor to maintain, the labor of choosing a preferred conclusion and building scaffolding around it sturdy enough to hold. Looking at Caspian now, he felt the scaffolding creak, not the comfortable creak of a structure settling, the other kind. "Where is she?" Caspian said. "Asleep. In the back room." "Then we have time." He didn't move from where he was standing. "Father, cancel the meeting." A long silence. Adrian's jaw worked. His eyes moved. to the corridor that led to the back rooms, then back to his son, then to some middle distance where the accounting happened for a man doing math that has no comfortable answer. Caspian watched it, did not push. Then Adrian walked to the writing desk in the corner of the room, sat down, and began writing the cancellation notices. Caspian exhaled once. Quietly. He moved to the window and stood with his back to his father while the notices were written, giving him the room to do it without being watched. Because some things required the small dignity of privacy to be done without resistance. Outside, the capital was beginning its morning, carts and early foot traffic, and the distant sound of a market district coming alive. And the sky over the eastern buildings had gone from gray to the particular pale gold that preceded full daylight. 3 notices, sealed. Adrian set them on the desk. "Now tell me," he said. Caspian turned from the window. He told him everything. He told him about the convoy and the distribution list, about Voss and the partial dossier, about Celine Marrow's documented absence before 6 years ago and the pattern of operations that matched her shadow profile, about Hendrik. And here he watched his father's face very carefully, because Hendrik was the piece that required a different kind of processing, the piece that reached back through Adrian's entire adult life in this household and recontextualized it in ways that weren't about Celine at all. Adrian went very still when Hendrik's name came up. He went the particular kind of still that isn't the absence of movement, but its opposite. The stillness of a person in whom a great deal is occurring at a level that isn't accessible from the outside. 8 years, he said. Yes. Hendrik has been... He stopped. His voice had a quality in it that Caspian hadn't heard before. Something stripped down. He came to my father's house when I was 19, before I held the title. I know. My father trusted him. I know. Adrian stood up from the desk. He walked to the window that Caspian had just left and stood there with his back to the room, and the morning light came in at an angle that made him look, briefly, older than Caspian had been accounting for. Not old, just carrying weight that hadn't been visible before. She knew about Hendrik, Adrian said. It wasn't quite a question. She would have needed to. He was her insurance inside the household, someone who could confirm or supplement whatever you were giving her directly. I didn't know I was giving her anything. No. Caspian said it without inflection, without emphasis. Not merciful exactly, just accurate. You weren't giving her anything. She was taking it. Those are different things and they produce the same result. Adrian's hands were on the window frame. His knuckles had gone pale. How bad, he said. Bad enough that I've been up all night and came here with 2.5 hours to stop something from getting significantly worse. Caspian moved across the room to stand closer, not quite beside him. How bad it gets from here is partly a function of what you do in the next hour. What do I do? You end it. He looked at his father's profile. All of it. Today. Whatever this has been, you end it, and then you help me finish what I started last night, because there are parts of this I can't access without you. Adrian was very still. She'll run, he said. We've already moved to prevent that. You don't know her. She's not... I know what she is. Caspian said it quietly, precisely. And I know you know it too. You've known something was wrong for months. You've been working very hard not to finish that thought. He paused. You don't have to finish it right now. You just have to make one decision and the rest will follow. The room held the silence. Outside, the city moved. Adrian Vale stood at the window with his hands on the frame and his son 6 feet behind him, and the weight of 8 years of compromised ground pressed down on the silence between them. And Caspian waited with the patience of a man who had spent the last several hours converting his anger into something load-bearing. Then Adrian turned from the window. His face had the quality of a man who has stopped performing composure and is operating on something raw and less managed. It was, Caspian noted, the most honest his father had looked in 11 months. Tell me what you need, Adrian said. Caspian opened his mouth to answer. From the back corridor came the sound of a door opening. Then Celine Marrow's voice, even and precise, and carrying the specific quality it always carried, the frequency that was calibrated slightly outside normal register. Adrian? A pause. A beat of silence that had texture to it. I think you should both come and see what I've left on the desk. Neither of them moved. In the silence that followed, Caspian understood two things simultaneously. She had been awake. She had heard everything. Neither of them moved. That was the first thing. The frozen quality of the 3 seconds after Celine's voice came down the corridor. The way both men registered the sound and its implications simultaneously, and the room went the particular kind of still that precedes irreversible things. Caspian felt it in his chest. His father felt it somewhere deeper, in the place where certainty had been living. Then Caspian moved. He crossed the room in 4 steps, put his hand flat against the corridor door before it could open further, and held it. Adrian! Celine's voice came through the wood, even and unhurried, the register of someone who has decided that urgency serves other people's interests, not hers. I'm not going to run. There's no point in holding the door. Caspian looked at his father. Adrian Vale was standing in the center of the room with his jacket still in his hand, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man in the process of watching something he built over 11 months disassemble itself in real time. Not grief yet. The thing before grief, the cognitive moment where the structure is visibly collapsing and the mind is still trying to run the calculation that produces a different result. She heard everything, Caspian said. Quiet. For his father only. I know. Which means she knows what we have. I know. Which means whatever she left on that desk, I know. Adrian set his jacket down on the nearest chair. Something in his posture changed. Not a collapse, not a surrender, but a settling, the way a building changes when a non-load-bearing wall comes down. What remained was structural, older. Let her in. Caspian held his position for 1 more second. Then he stepped back from the door. Celine Marrow came into the room the way she always moved, without announcement, without the social theater of entry, simply present in the space as though she had always been there, and the room had arranged itself around her rather than the other way around. She was dressed. She had been dressed for some time, Caspian noted. Her hair was done, her coat was on, the particular efficiency of someone who had made decisions before the rest of the room caught up. She looked at Caspian first. He looked back. Then she looked at Adrian, and something in her face shifted. Not softness, not regret, but a kind of precise acknowledgement. The way a surgeon looks at a patient they've been working on for a long time, when the procedure has reached its terminal phase. The desk, she said. Adrian walked to the writing desk in the corner. On its surface, next to the 3 sealed cancellation notices, was a single document. 1 page. Adrian picked it up and read it, and Caspian watched his father's face change in the reading. Watched it move through something that had no clean name, something compound and devastating in the way that only the truth can be devastating when it arrives at the end of a long investment in the alternative. He set the page down without speaking. Caspian crossed the room and picked it up. It was a transfer document, dated 6 weeks ago, Celine Marrow, or the name attached to the identity Caspian now understood to be constructed, listed as the authorized recipient of a set of intelligence dispatches originating from inside the Imperial administrative apparatus. The dispatches were itemized. The Eastern Border arbitration terms were 4th on the list. The Northern Garrison rotation was 2nd. The Vale Household Military Positioning Assessment, an internal document that Adrian had commissioned himself and which had never left the house through any channel Caspian had been aware of, was 1st. At the bottom of the page, in a notation that had the quality of something left deliberately visible, was a reference number that corresponded to an Imperial intelligence operation designation. Caspian looked up from the page. "You're leaving this for us," he said. "Yes." "Why?" Celine looked at him with the gray eyes that operated at their particular calibrated frequency. "Because the operation is over. The Eastern Border position leaves the country today regardless of whether your father holds that meeting. It left through a secondary channel 48 hours ago." She paused. "The meeting this morning was a redundancy. I don't need it anymore." The room absorbed this. Adrian made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Caspian looked at his father and then looked back at Celine. "Then why are you still here?" Caspian said. "Because I wanted to be." She held his gaze. and because there's a difference between completing an operation and finishing a conversation. We're not having a conversation. We're having the only one that matters. She moved, not toward either of them, just a slight repositioning, the way a person adjusts when they want the room's geometry to change. Your father deserves to hear what actually happened, not the version you'll construct from documents and confession records, the actual version. Adrian's voice came from somewhere behind Caspian. Then tell it. But she told it. She did not tell it with apology or with the performance of remorse, which would have been worse, more insulting, somehow, than the clean accounting she actually delivered. She told it the way she did most things, precisely, without ornamentation, in the order that served comprehension rather than emotion. She had been positioned 8 months before Adrian met her at Havelock's function. The positioning had required establishing a presence in the capital's diplomatic social circuit, attending the right functions, being seen at the right tables, becoming known in the peripheral awareness of the people she was being positioned to access. She had done this for 8 months before the Havelock function, and in those 8 months she had identified Adrian Vale's particular shape of vulnerability. Not weakness, she was careful with that word, but the specific topology of a man who had spent decades excelling at performance and had developed, as a consequence of that excellence, a profound exhaustion with it. A man who needed to be seen without the performance running. She had been trained to find that shape. She had found it. The relationship that followed had been, she said, operationally designed. Every conversation, every revelation, every moment of apparent intimacy had been calibrated. She had known, from the first evening on Havelock's terrace, what she was building toward and what it would cost the man she was building it with. "Did you feel anything?" Adrian said from behind Caspian. A pause. "That's not a useful question," she said. "It's the only one I'm asking." She looked at Adrian directly for the first time since entering the room. The look lasted 3 seconds. Something in it was not nothing, but it was not enough. It was not close to enough for the math Adrian was trying to do with it, and Caspian could see his father understand this in real time, see the last calculation come back without the answer it was looking for. "No," she said, because she was not, it turned out, someone who lied when the truth did equivalent damage. Adrian nodded once, looked away. Caspian set the transfer document back on the desk. "Hendrik," he said, "was recruited 3 years before I arrived," she said. "He was already in place. I inherited him as an asset. He knows who you actually work for. He knows what I told him, which was 1 layer closer to the truth than what he needed to know, and 3 layers short of the actual structure." She looked at Caspian with something that might, in different circumstances, have been respect. "You found him faster than the modeling suggested." The modeling. There are models for how quickly different types of investigators move through different types of evidence. You moved faster than your profile suggested. That's notable. Caspian felt a cold clarity settle through him, the sensation of understanding, at full resolution, that he had been a variable in someone else's calculation, that his movements, his methods, his particular brand of competence had been observed and assessed and factored into an architecture he hadn't known existed. It produced something in his chest that wasn't rage, but occupied the same temperature, a dry, clarifying fury that burned without consuming. "What's the actual structure?" he said. "You already know I won't answer that." "Harwick." The name landed in the room with a different quality than the others. Something changed in Celine's face. Controlled, rapid, but present. The first involuntary response he'd produced from her. "Where did you get that name?" she said. "Hendrik gave it to me." A silence. "Hendrik doesn't know that name." He knew a title. The title was enough. Caspian watched her. "Deputy Chancellor Harwick has been running this operation from inside the Imperial apparatus. You're a field operative, a very good one, but you report to someone, and that someone has been sitting inside the Crown's administrative structure for long enough to compromise it at the level that made everything else possible." Celine was very still. In the stillness, Caspian understood something he hadn't fully articulated until this moment. She was calculating whether he actually had what he claimed, or whether he was constructing forward from a partial name and watching her reaction to confirm the structure. She was doing it right in front of him, and she knew that he knew she was doing it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. If you move on Harwick without sufficient documentation, she said, he will dismantle the case in 6 hours and have you removed from any position of institutional relevance before the weekends. He has the access and the relationships to do it. A pause. I'm telling you this because it's true, not because it helps me. Why would you tell me anything that doesn't help you? Because Harwick burned 3 of my predecessors to protect his position. Operatives who completed their assignments and were then exposed by their own handler to prevent the operation from tracing back to him. Something in her voice had changed, fractional, controlled, but present. I've been aware for 4 months that this operation was scheduled to end the same way. The room was very quiet. Adrian spoke from the window where he'd moved at some point during the accounting. She's been working against her own handler. Caspian looked at his father, then back at Celine. The document you left on the desk, he said. The transfer record with the operation designation. That's your insurance. It's documentation that Harwick's operation compromised Imperial intelligence for 8 years. If it reaches the right people before he can contain it, he loses the protection that makes him untouchable. She looked at Caspian without expression. I can't deliver it. I'm a foreign operative with a constructed identity and no institutional standing. It needs to come from inside. From the Vale household. From Caspian Vale, who has spent the last 2 weeks building a documented case that now has my testimony attached to it. She let the sentence sit. You need me. And I need to not disappear into an Imperial detention facility before this reaches the Imperial Council. The silence that followed had the quality of a space where everything has just fundamentally reorganized. Caspian stood in the center of it and felt the weight of what was being offered and what it cost and what it required him to become. The version of himself that could work with this woman, that could hold the operational utility of her cooperation in one hand and the full accounting of what she had done in the other, and function, not forgive, not excuse. Function. He looked at his father. Adrian was at the window with the morning light on his face, and he was not the man who had left Ironfield 11 months ago. Not the man in the hired carriage. Not the man who'd stood in that private residence and told his son that what he had here was freedom. That man had been running from something and calling it arrival. What stood at the window now was older than that, stripped of the scaffolding, present in the room in a way he hadn't been in a very long time. What do you need from me? Adrian said, to Celine, directly. She looked at him. Nothing, she said. What I needed from you is already in motion. What happens next doesn't require you. Something in Adrian's jaw tightened. Not offense. The harder thing, understanding. Then what am I? He said. In this, what was I? Celine held his gaze. A door, she said. I needed a door that Harwick's operation didn't have access to, and you were one. I'm sorry that's what the answer is. Adrian nodded. Once. Slowly. He looked at Caspian. Tell me what to do, he said. And it cost him something significant to say it. Caspian could see exactly what it cost. But he said it without flinching, which was its own kind of character, the bruised kind that survives after the polished version is gone. Caspian turned back to Celine. The testimony, he said, full and documented. Every operation, every contact, the complete Harwick structure as far as you have access to it. Yes? And you stay in this house, under supervision, until the Imperial Council has acted. A pause. Yes. If you run, I won't run. She said it flatly. I have nowhere useful to go. Harwick has already issued a containment order on me. I became a liability when Hendrick's name went into your investigation record. If I go back to my network, I'm dead within 72 hours. She looked at him without performance, without the calibrated register. For the first time, Caspian thought he was seeing the actual person behind the instrument. She was not warm, she was not remorseful, but she was present in a way the performance had prevented. I'm not cooperating because I've reconsidered my values. I'm cooperating because the alternative ends with my body in the river and Harwick walking away clean. Those are the actual stakes. Caspian respected that. He would not have respected the other version. Then we start now, he said. Before Harwick's people realize the morning meeting was canceled and start asking why. Shut. They worked for 3 hours in the private residence while the city outside went about its morning. Celine sat at the writing desk and produced, methodically, with the organizational precision of someone who had been maintaining this material in her own memory for years against the possibility of exactly this kind of contingency. A document that grew from 1 page to 11, then 17, then 23. Names, dates, transmission methods, the structure of Harwick's network inside the Imperial apparatus, the identities of 3 additional assets embedded in noble households across the capital, the mechanism by which the Eastern Border intelligence had been routed to a foreign power through 3 intermediary channels specifically designed to make the origin untraceable. Caspian read each page as it came. He did not speak except to ask clarifying questions, which she answered without resistance. Adrian sat in the far corner of the room and said nothing. He was present. That was what he was doing. Being present in the room while the full accounting of what his presence in that household had enabled was written down on paper in front of him. He did not look away from it. Caspian noted this. It was not a small thing. At 9:30, a courier arrived at the residence door, one of Caspian's from Ironfield, carrying a sealed update from Hendrik's ongoing confession. Caspian read it in the corridor. His hand tightened on the paper. He went back into the room. "There's a problem," he said. Celine looked up from the desk. "The Northern Garrison," Caspian said. "The rotation schedule that Hendrik passed through the channel, it wasn't just passed to Harwick's apparatus, it was forwarded." He held up the paper. "Hendrik has a secondary contact. Someone he was feeding independently without Celine's knowledge, without Harwick's authorization. A private arrangement." Celine set down her pen. Something in her face, the first genuine surprise he'd seen from her. Not controlled, not calibrated. The real thing. "That's not possible," she said. "Hendrik's communications were monitored. Every transmission went through my oversight." "Every transmission you knew about." A silence. "Who's the secondary contact?" she said. Caspian looked at the paper again, at the name Hendrik had written in his careful administrative hand at 2 a.m. with the full weight of 31 years of compromise behind it. He looked up. "Lord Aldrich," he said, "your father's oldest ally, the man who was scheduled to attend this morning's briefing." The room held the silence for 3 full seconds. Then Celine stood up from the desk. "Aldrich isn't just an ally," she said, and her voice had a quality in it now that Caspian hadn't heard before. The stripped-down register of someone whose operational model has just been fundamentally disrupted. "If Aldrich has been running a parallel channel through Hendrik, then this operation is larger than Harwick told me. Aldrich is connected to a faction that Harwick doesn't control." She looked at Caspian with the gray eyes moving fast, the assessment running in real time. "Which means Harwick didn't build this alone. Which means there are 2 competing foreign interests running parallel destabilization operations through your household simultaneously." Adrian stood up from the corner. "Aldrich Inam," he said. The name came out with the particular weight of a word that contains 30 years of history. "Aldrich has been—" "We don't know what Aldrich has been yet," Caspian said. "We know he has a secondary channel through Hendrik. We know the northern rotation went to him." "He's been in my house every month for 30 years, Adrian said. "He was at my father's deathbed. He was the first person I called when Caspian was born." "I know." "I trusted—" Adrian stopped, looked at his own hands. Something was moving through him that Caspian recognized as the sensation of a man discovering, in sequence, that the ground beneath every fixed point in his life has been hollow, and that the discovery does not end when you think it has, but continues, finding new depth, new reach, new territory that needs to be re-examined. 30 years of trusted ground going hollow, in real time, in a single morning. This was what it cost. This was the shape of the bill arriving. Caspian looked at his father and understood, with a clarity that had nothing comfortable in it, that the man standing there was not the man he'd been angry at for 11 months. The man he'd been angry at had been choosing blindness, actively, willfully, with full access to the information that would have corrected it. This man had had the blindness extended downward through 30 years of his life without his participation, and was now standing in the rubble of an architecture he'd never been shown the blueprints for. Different things. Adjacent damage. The same wreckage. "Father," Caspian said. Adrian looked up. "We need to move on Aldrich before he knows we have Hendrik's secondary confession. If Harwick and Aldrich are running competing operations, they'll communicate the moment either of them realizes the morning meeting fell apart. We have—" He looked at the clock on the wall. "Maybe 2 hours before that communication happens, and Aldrich understands he's been exposed." Adrian straightened. The settling thing happened again, the structure clarifying after the non-structural elements fell away. "What do you need?" "Aldrich trusts you. He'll meet you without question. I need you to call him to a location I control, on a pretext he'll believe, within the hour. And then? And then we finish this." Caspian held his father's gaze. "Together." Adrian looked at him for a long moment. The morning light had moved across the room while they'd been working, and it came now through the west-facing window at a lower angle, cutting across the floor and the writing desk where Celine's 23 pages of documented conspiracy sat in a pile. And it illuminated the silver ring on the desk. The ring Adrian had left on the Ironfield entry table the morning he walked out, which someone, Caspian realized, must have brought here, and which meant his father had retrieved it at some point in the last 11 months and not been able to fully let go of what it represented. Adrian saw Caspian see the ring. Neither of them named it. "I'll call Aldrich," Adrian said. He reached for the ring, put it on, looked at it for 1 second on his hand. Then he sat down and wrote the note. Eat. The Imperial courier left at 10 past 10. By 10:45, Aldrich's reply had come back. Brief, warm. The response of a man who had been waiting for his old friend to reach out for months and had read the invitation as exactly the reconciliation it appeared to be. He would come at noon. Caspian stood in the residence's small study with Celine's 23 pages in his hand and felt the shape of what the next 2 hours required. Not just from him, from his father, who was going to have to sit across a table from a man he had trusted for 30 years and hold the knowledge of what that trust had been built on, and hold it without showing it until the moment came. He thought about what that required of a person. The specific quality of self-control it demanded, not the performed composure he'd watched his father maintain for 30 years, but something rawer than that. The composure that came not from habit, but from necessity, from being out of options, from understanding that the thing you had to do was the only thing left and so you did it, changed by necessity, in real time, into the version of yourself the moment demanded. He looked at his father across the room. Adrian Vale was sitting with his hands folded on the desk, looking at nothing in particular, doing the internal work that had no external expression. Preparing. Caspian thought, this is what it looks like when a man who has spent 11 months running from the hardest version of himself finally runs out of road. The door opened. Celine came in from the corridor. There's a problem, she said, for the second time in an hour. Her voice had the particular quality, the stripped-down register, that Caspian had learned in the last 3 hours meant what she was about to say was real. Harwick's people are outside, she said. 2 of them, on the street. They weren't there an hour ago. Caspian was at the window in 3 steps. 2 men, on the corner opposite. Still, not moving with the foot traffic, watching the building with the particular quality of attention that was trained rather than casual. One of them had a hand inside his coat. He turned back. Aldrich's reply had come too fast. The realization arrived with the cold clarity of something that had been true all along and had just become visible. The reply had come from a man who already knew about the morning meeting's cancellation, who had already spoken to Harwick, who had used the 45 minutes between the courier's departure and his reply to make 2 calls that Caspian couldn't undo. Noon was not a reconciliation. Noon was a trap. And in 30 seconds, when those men outside received confirmation that Caspian Vale, Adrian Vale, and the foreign operative with 23 pages of documented conspiracy were all in the same building, they were not going to keep waiting on the corner. Back door, Caspian said. Watched, Celine said. I checked before I came in. How many total? At least 4 visible. More I can't see. She held his gaze. We need to split. No. Caspian. We don't split. He looked at her, at his father, at the 23 pages in his hand. We have one play. We make it together. He picked up the sealed pages and looked at his father directly. You know this building. Every exit, every servant access point. Think. Adrian Vale stood up. There was nothing left in his face except the moment. No history, no grief, no 30 years of hollow ground. Just the immediate, terrible clarity of a man who has finally, irrevocably, run out of the option of running. There's a delivery passage, he said, below the kitchen. It exits on the alley side. Does Harwick know this building? He's never been inside it. Caspian looked at the window. The men on the corner hadn't moved yet. 30 seconds, maybe less. Go, he said. His father moved first, which was the thing Caspian would remember later. Not the passage, not the alley, not what came after. The way Adrian Vale at 54, having lost everything that wasn't structural, moved first without being asked twice. Moved like a man who had finally stopped performing survival and started doing it. They went through the building fast and low and quiet, and behind them, on the corner of the street, the two men in coats received a message on a folded note delivered by a third man who had come from the direction of the northern quarter, and they read it, and they stopped watching the building's front entrance, and they began to move. Inside the delivery passage, in the dark and the cold, with the 23 pages pressed against his chest, and his father 6 inches ahead of him, and Celine 3 inches behind, Caspian Vale understood something that had no room for language in it. This was no longer a household investigation. This was war. And he had just committed his family to the middle of it with no institutional protection, no guaranteed allies, and an empire that didn't yet know it needed saving. The passage door opened onto the alley. Cold air. Gray morning. They ran. The alley ran south for 40 meters before it opened onto a service road that fed into the capital's eastern market district. Caspian knew this because he had spent the last 2 weeks memorizing the geography around his father's residence, the way he memorized everything he might need, quietly, without announcing the preparation, in case the preparation became necessary. It had become necessary. They moved fast, not running. Running attracted the kind of attention that got people stopped by City Watch, and City Watch had its own relationship with Deputy Chancellor Harwick that Caspian was not prepared to test at this moment. Walking fast, in the gray morning air, through the service road and into the first side street that offered cover from the market district's main flow. Adrian was breathing hard but steady. Celine was not breathing hard at all, which told Caspian something about her training that he filed and did not comment on. "Where are we going?" Adrian said. "Voss," Caspian said. "The intelligence office will have Harwick's reach." Not Voss's office. Voss personally. He turned left at the next intersection, moving by memory now, the street map running in his head like a parallel track beneath the immediate problem. She has a private location, one that isn't in any official record. She told me about it 3 years ago in a context that I don't think she expected me to retain. Celine looked at him sideways while they walked. "You retain everything. When it seems like it might matter. That's a lonely way to live." "It's been useful this week," he said. Voss's private location was a room above a cartographer's shop in the documentary district, the same shop where they'd met before, which was either reassuring or alarming depending on how you read operational patterns. Caspian chose reassuring. He didn't have bandwidth for the alternative. She answered his knock in 40 seconds, which meant she'd been awake and close to the door, which meant she'd been expecting something. She looked at the three of them. Her eyes went to Celine and stayed there for 3 seconds with a professional quality of assessment that contained no warmth and no hostility. Pure inventory. "Inside," she said. The room was small. 1 table, 3 chairs, a window that faced the alley rather than the street. Caspian put the 23 pages on the table. Voss looked at them, then at Celine. "You wrote this," she said. "Yes." "In the last 3 hours?" "Yes." "From memory." "I don't commit things to external record unless I have no choice," Celine said. 8 years of operation detail. Every transmission, every contact, every structural layer of Harwick's network that I was read into. She looked at Voss without performance. "Read it. You'll recognize the operation designations. Some of them you've seen before without understanding what you were looking at." Voss picked up the first page. Caspian let her read for 90 seconds before he spoke. Harwick knows the morning meeting was canceled. He's moved operatives to the residence. Aldrich is his confederate and was using the noon meeting as a containment operation. He kept his voice level and quick. We have maybe 4 hours before Harwick understands we're mobile with this documentation and moves to seal his institutional position. After that, any approach to the Imperial Council goes through channels he controls. Voss set the page down. There's a summit, she said, in 3 days. The Imperial Council's quarterly review. Every council member in the same building for 2 days. She looked at Caspian. If this reaches them before the summit concludes, Harwick can't contain it. I know. But 3 days is 3 days. She looked at the window. He'll move to discredit the source material in that time. Constructed identity, foreign operative, no institutional standing. She glanced at Celine. No offense. None taken, Celine said. It's accurate. He'll also move on your household directly. If the Vale name is attached to this documentation, he'll have grounds to open a formal investigation into the Duke's conduct, the information sharing, the relationship with a foreign national, and use the investigation to bog the council presentation in procedural challenge. Voss looked at Adrian for the first time. Your conduct over the last 11 months is a liability. Adrian held her gaze. I know. You'll need to get ahead of it. A formal statement of disclosure, voluntary, preemptive, on the record, removes some of Harwick's leverage. She paused. It will cost you the title. I know, Adrian said again. Caspian looked at his father. Adrian was looking at Voss with the expression of a man who has finished the accounting, who has run every number and arrived at the total and accepted it. Not without cost. The acceptance had physical weight. You could see it in the set of his shoulders, the line of his jaw. But it was there, genuine, the kind of acceptance that only came after you stopped arguing with the arithmetic. Then let's start drafting it, Adrian said. They worked through the afternoon in Voss's room, the 4 of them around the small table with the 23 pages and the disclosure statement taking shape beside them, and the city outside moved through its afternoon rhythms without any awareness that in a room above a cartographer's shop, an empire's internal architecture was being reconstructed from the rubble up. At 3:30, a courier Voss trusted brought word from the Imperial Administrative District. Harwick had convened an emergency session with 3 senior council members. The stated agenda was a security review of noble household communications protocols. The actual agenda, readable between the official lines to anyone who understood the institutional language, was the beginning of the process by which a sitting deputy chancellor moved to insulate himself from an approaching exposure. He's moving faster than expected, Celine said. He's scared, Caspian said. Scared men with institutional power are the most dangerous kind. She looked at the courier's note. He's going to try to get the Vale household's military correspondence classified under the security review. If he succeeds, our documentation becomes evidence in a sealed proceeding that he controls. Caspian looked at Voss. How fast can you get us to the council? Not fast enough through official channels. Voss was already thinking. He could see it in the particular quality of her stillness, the way she'd gone inward while remaining physically present. There's one path. The summit pre-brief. The day before the quarterly review, the council chair receives private presentations from institutional stakeholders. It's informal, off the official record, designed for exactly the kind of material that needs to reach the council before it reaches the broader proceeding. Who's the council chair? Lady Marin Ashford. Voss looked at Adrian. Who was a close ally of your father's and has not, as far as I'm aware, shifted that alliance. Adrian straightened. Marin will hear me. She'll hear you in a room that Harwick can't access and can't classify and can't bury under procedural challenge, Voss said. If we can get the documentation to her before tomorrow evening's pre-brief. That's 28 hours, Caspian said. Yes. In which Harwick is actively moving to seal his position. Yes. A silence. Caspian looked at the table. The 23 pages, the half-drafted disclosure statement, the courier's note with its neatly terrifying implications. He looked at his father, who was already composing in his head the approach to Lady Ashford, running the 30-year relationship through his assessment like a man checking load-bearing capacity under stress. He looked at Celine, who was looking at nothing in particular with the gray eyes moving through something internal that he couldn't read and had stopped trying to. He thought about what the next 28 hours required. It required them to move through a capital where Harwick's people were looking for them, with documentation that would end careers and possibly lives if it reached the wrong hands first, toward a single meeting that was the only clean path to the people with the institutional authority to act. It required his father to walk into Lady Ashford's presence and disclose, voluntarily and on record, 11 months of conduct that would cost him everything he hadn't already spent. It required Caspian to trust Voss's network, Celine's testimony, and his father's access in equal measure, which was 3 categories of trust he wouldn't have considered 3 weeks ago. It required, in short, exactly the thing that every crisis of this magnitude required: that you stopped being the version of yourself who could afford caution and became the version that could afford only forward. "We move tonight," Caspian said, "before Harwick's security review produces any formal orders." Everyone at the table nodded. They moved at 10. Voss had 3 trusted contacts in the capital's courier network, people who moved through the city at hours when the city watch was inattentive, and who asked no questions that their payment didn't require. 2 of them went ahead as forward scouts. The third stayed with the group. The route to Lady Ashford's private residence crossed 4 districts. Caspian had memorized it. They went on foot, in the dark, through the capital's older streets where the buildings were close enough together that the upper stories nearly touched, and the lamplight didn't reach the ground evenly. The city at this hour had its own population, people moving with the particular purposefulness of those who operated in the margins between the official day and the official night, and who were practiced at not seeing things that weren't their business. Nobody stopped them. Adrian moved with a quality that Caspian kept clocking and filing. Not the performed ease of a man who belonged everywhere by birthright, but something more fundamental than that. The ease of a man who had lost the thing that made ease necessary to perform. He moved through the dark streets of his own capital as though he'd been stripped of his title already, and found, to his own apparent surprise, that he was still capable of forward motion without it, that the loss of the scaffolding had not taken the structure with it. Caspian thought, this is who he was before 30 years of power arranged itself around him and became the thing he confused for his own character. Celine walked 3 feet behind Caspian and said nothing. At the crossing before the Ashford residence's street, she touched his arm. He stopped. Adrian and the courier moved 2 steps ahead before stopping as well. "There's a man on the corner," she said. Quiet. Close to his ear. "Blue coat. He's been parallel to us since the market district." Caspian didn't look. "One of Harwick's. Probably, or Aldrich's. At this point the distinction is narrowing." She paused. "He hasn't moved to intercept. He's tracking. He wants to know where we're going." "Yes." Caspian processed this for 3 seconds. If the tale reported their destination to Harwick before they reached Ashford, Harwick would have time to reach out to Ashford's household directly, not with force, but with the softer instrument of institutional pressure. A word from the Deputy Chancellor's office suggesting that the people approaching were under active security review. The kind of word that didn't have to be true to be effective. "Can you lose him?" Caspian said. "Alone, yes. With 3 other people, so complicated." He looked at his father, at the courier, back at Celine. "Take the documents," he said. He pressed the 23 pages into her hands. "You and Voss's courier go ahead. Different route. You know this city well enough. And you. My father and I take the direct route. We draw the tail." He held her gaze. "If we're stopped, the documents are already at Ashford's. If we're not, we meet you at the east gate of the residence in 20 minutes. She looked at the pages in her hands, looked at him. "If Harwick's people stop you, then it becomes a different kind of problem." He didn't dress it up. 20 minutes. She went. They were stopped at the corner of Aldgate and Market Cross, where 2 men in plain coats stepped out of a doorway with the particular body language of people who have been waiting and are done waiting. Not City Watch. The coats were wrong. The quality of attention was wrong. City Watch looked at your face. These men looked at your hands, your coat, the specific geometry of how you were standing, which was the look of people trained to assess threat potential rather than identity. Harwick's. Caspian felt his pulse adjust. Not accelerate exactly, but recalibrate, the way it did when the situation moved from navigation to something more immediate. He breathed through it, kept his hands visible. Duke Vale, the nearer man said, to Adrian, acknowledging the title with a quality that made the acknowledgement feel like a leash. Deputy Chancellor Harwick requests that you accompany us for a conversation regarding certain security matters. Adrian looked at the man. In the lamplight, Caspian watched his father's face and saw the thing he'd been watching develop across the last 18 hours reach its final form. There was no performance left. No cultivated ducal authority. No 30 years of practiced command. Just a man of 54 who understood exactly what this moment cost and had decided, in some specific instant between the private residence and this lamplit corner, that the cost was the price of what came next, and that what came next was worth it. I don't believe, Adrian said, that I'm required to accompany anyone on the basis of a verbal request with no documentation. The man's jaw tightened. Sir, the Deputy Chancellor can issue a formal writ through the Council's administrative office during business hours, Adrian said, at which point I'll be delighted to comply. He looked at the man with the flat certainty of someone who has stopped having anything to lose and found it clarifying. Tonight, I have a prior engagement. He walked forward. The two men did not move aside, but they did not move to stop him either, because stopping a sitting duke on a public street without formal documentation was a different order of action than requesting his compliance, and these men were trained to understand the institutional difference. They looked at each other. Caspian moved at his father's shoulder. The men let them pass. They walked the remaining 2 blocks to Lady Ashford's residence at a pace that didn't change, and Caspian felt his father's arm brush his own as they turned the final corner, and neither of them said anything. Lady Maren Ashford was 70 years old, which she wore the way certain people wore age, as a form of compressed authority, the kind that accumulates when someone has been right about enough things over enough decades that they've stopped feeling the need to convince anyone of it. She received them in her private study at 10:20, in a dressing gown, with her gray hair loose and her eyes fully alert, which told Caspian she had been awake and had been told they were coming. Celine and the courier were already inside. Ashford looked at all 4 of them with the gaze of a woman sorting variables. Then she looked at Adrian. You look like you've had a significant night, she said. Several of them, he said. Sit down. They sat. She read the 23 pages in 20 minutes, without interrupting, without expression. She read the partial disclosure statement. She read the Hendrik confession summary that Caspian had prepared. She asked 4 questions, each of which targeted a specific evidentiary gap with the precision of someone who had spent decades in imperial governance and understood exactly where documentation was vulnerable. Caspian answered 3. Celine answered the 4th. Ashford looked at Celine. You understand that your testimony, as a foreign operative with no verified identity, is inadmissible in any formal council proceeding. Yes, Celine said, but the operation designations in this document are verifiable through the Intelligence Office's own classified records, which means the document authenticates itself, and your identity is secondary to its content. Yes. Ashford nodded once. She looked at Adrian. The disclosure statement, she said, you're volunteering this. Yes. It removes your title. I know what it removes. She studied him for a moment. The particular attention of someone taking the measure of a person they've known a long time and are reassessing. Your father, she said, would be furious and proud in equal measure. Adrian said nothing. I'll present this at tomorrow's pre-brief, Ashford said. She picked up the 23 pages. Harwick will move to challenge it the moment the session opens. Can you hold the challenge? Long enough. She looked at Caspian. I need your guarantee that the documentation survives any attempt to classify it under the security review order. It's already in 3 separate secure locations, Caspian said. Removing it from record would require simultaneous action on all 3, which would itself be documentable. She looked at him for a moment with something that might have been the closest she came to being impressed. "Your father's son," she said. Eventually. She stood. They stood. "Go somewhere Harwick's people can't reach you before morning," she said. "What happens at the pre-brief happens without you in the room. That's how this has to work." They were almost at the door when she spoke again. "Adrian." He stopped. "Your family's here," she said. Not a question. "Yes. All of it. Your sons, your wife." She paused. "They held this together while you were otherwise occupied. Make sure you know that." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. They went to Ironfield. It was past midnight when they came through the east gate. Caspian, Adrian, Celine, the courier they'd borrowed from Voss. And the house received them with its old stone quiet, the night staff moving with the subdued efficiency of people who had learned in the last several months to absorb unusual things without comment. Ivana was in the east sitting room. She had been there when Caspian left, and she appeared in the quality of her composure to have remained in essentially the same state of controlled vigil for the intervening hours. She was sitting with her correspondence arranged, and a cup of tea that had gone cold, and a lamp burning at the precise angle that told Caspian she'd been reading rather than waiting, which was her way of waiting. She looked up when they came in. She looked at Caspian, who gave her a single nod that meant what it meant. She looked at Celine, beside whom she held her gaze for 3 seconds with the expression of a woman who has understood this situation at full resolution for some time and is seeing the resolution for the first time in 3 dimensions. She looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at his wife. Caspian felt the temperature of that silence and made the decision to leave it room. He said, "I need to check on Hendrik's situation," and moved toward the door, and Celine followed him without being asked, which told him she understood the geometry of the moment as well as he did. He pulled the door closed behind them. In the corridor, he stood with his back against the wall and breathed for the first time in hours. Celine stood opposite him, the 23 pages folded into her coat, the gray eyes doing what they did, the calibrated assessment that never fully stopped. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "If Ashford holds the challenge, she'll hold it. And if Harwick moves before the pre-brief, we've done everything we can do tonight." He looked at her. "You know that's true." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't have a good history with everything we can do," she said. "It's usually a way of saying the rest is luck." "Yes," Caspian said. "It is." She looked at him with something that was not the calibrated assessment, something underneath it, real and briefly uncontrolled. Then it was gone. "Get some sleep," she said, which was as close as she was going to come to acknowledging that she was exhausted, and he was exhausted, and that the next 12 hours were going to require them to be neither. He went to his father's office. He sat at the desk with the Northern Territory map on the wall opposite, the map he'd looked at his entire life, the one his father had stood in front of 1,000 times with the wooden pointer. And he worked through the morning hours on the documentation he couldn't leave to chance. Backup copies of the Hendrik confession, a second disclosure statement drafted in his own name that corroborated his father's, a timeline of the security breaches with sourcing that didn't depend on Celine's testimony alone. He worked until the sky outside the east-facing window began its shift from black to the specific gray that preceded dawn. At 5:30, a rider came through the gate at speed. The message he carried was from Voss. Caspian read it at the desk. His hands went still. He read it again. Harwick had not waited for the pre-brief. At 3 a.m, under the emergency provisions of the Security Review Order, Deputy Chancellor Harwick had convened a sealed session with the 2 senior council members most aligned with his faction. In that session, he had produced his own documentation, a counter-narrative built over the last 18 hours that framed the Vale household's activities as a rogue intelligence operation conducted without Imperial authorization. The document named Caspian Vale as its architect. It named Celine Marrow as a foreign asset being run by the Vale household against the Empire's interests. It named Adrian Vale as a compromised operator who had been knowingly facilitating foreign intelligence access. The sealed session had issued a formal containment order, effective at dawn. The order authorized the physical seizure of any documentation held by the Vale household related to the security review, and the temporary detention of any persons named in the order pending council review. Dawn was in 40 minutes. Caspian was on his feet before he finished the second reading. He went to his father's room first, then Ivana's, then Celine's. 3 doors in 90 seconds, 3 people pulled from whatever approximation of sleep they'd managed, 3 faces absorbing the information with the varying speeds of people processing under extreme duress. In the corridor, with all of them assembled, Caspian looked at the 4 people in front of him. His father, his mother, a foreign operative with 23 pages under her arm, and Voss's courier who had materialized from somewhere and was now apparently part of whatever this had become, and made the calculation that the situation required. The documentation was Ashford's only if it reached her before the containment order was served. The containment order was served at dawn. Dawn was 38 minutes. Lady Ashford's residence was 20 minutes at speed. "Horses," Caspian said to the courier. "Now!" The courier ran. "The documents," Caspian said, to Celine. "All copies. On you." Already. She had them. He looked at his mother. Ivana looked back at him with the particular expression she'd worn his entire life when the situation exceeded normal parameters. Not fear, not performed calm, but the working face. The face that meant she was already 3 steps into solving the problem and needed him to stop talking and move. "I'm coming," she said before he could speak. "Mother." "I'm coming, Caspian." Her voice was iron. "I have been managing this family's institutional relationships for 30 years. I know Marin Ashford. If there is any human being alive who can hold a challenge long enough for this documentation to matter, it is me, in that room, with her." She looked at him. "Don't waste time arguing." He didn't waste time. They went. Massant. The ride to Ashford's residence took 17 minutes at the pace they rode it, which was the pace of people who had stopped calculating the acceptable risk of speed versus visibility and committed to speed as the only variable that mattered. The capital's pre-dawn streets were near empty. Delivery workers, night shift guards, the occasional early riser, and they moved through all of it with the focused momentum of a column that had one destination and no alternative. 15 minutes. Caspian rode at the front with the cold morning air on his face and the full weight of the next hour pressing on his chest, and he thought, in the fragments of cognition that existed between the immediate demands of navigation and pace, about what it meant to be here. Not here on this road, in this moment. Here in the full sense. He had spent the last 2 weeks converting every feeling that wasn't useful into fuel for the next step. The anger. The grief of watching his father dissolve into someone he didn't recognize. The older grief, which he was only now beginning to access, of understanding that some of what he'd thought was the house's solid ground had been hollow before he was old enough to know the difference. He had converted it all, ran on it, used it. And now, in the last minutes before whatever came next, he let himself feel the shape of what he was riding toward. Not the outcome, which he couldn't control, but the fact of the attempt. The fact that his father was 3 horses behind him, riding toward the accounting he should have forced on himself 11 months ago. The fact that his mother was beside him, 60 seconds from the Ashford gate, having made the decision without discussion to be part of the solution to a crisis her husband had created. The fact that he had held the household together through all of it, and was still holding and was still moving. It wasn't pride. Pride was too simple. It was something more like the recognition that you found out what you were made of, not in the comfortable moments, but in the ones that required you to become something you didn't know you could be, that the structure only revealed itself under the load. The Ashford gate appeared ahead, 10 minutes before dawn. He drove his horse through the gate at a pace that brought Ashford's overnight guard out of his station with his weapon drawn. "Caspian Vale," he said, pulling up. "Lady Ashford is expecting us." The guard looked at the group. 6 people. Horses hard-ridden. The sky above the eastern buildings going pale at its very edge. "She's awake, sir," the guard said, and something in how he said it told Caspian that Ashford had given instructions, that she had known this was coming, that she had been awake for hours preparing for exactly this convergence. They dismounted. They went inside. Ashford's study door was open. She was at her desk with the 23 pages already spread in front of her, the copies Celine had delivered the night before, and 3 additional people in the room that Caspian didn't immediately recognize, who turned out to be, on closer inspection, council members. Not Harwick's faction, the other kind. She looked up when they came through the door. She looked at Ivana, and something in her face shifted. Recognition, relief, the particular quality of seeing a resource arrive exactly when you need it. "You have 10 minutes, Ashford said, before Harwick's formal notification reaches this door. After that, everything in this room is on the record of an active council session that predates and supersedes his containment order." She looked at Caspian. "The documentation." Celine put the 23 pages on the desk. Ashford looked at the 3 council members. "You've seen the preliminary material." "Yes," said the nearest one, a woman in her 50s with the bearing of someone who'd made hard decisions at speed before. "Then we proceed." Ashford looked at Caspian. "Your testimony, on record." He opened his mouth. The door at the far end of the corridor opened. Not the front entrance, the servants' corridor, the interior door. And from it came the sound of boots on stone, multiple sets, moving fast with the particular rhythm of people who had been told they had a window and were using all of it. Harwick's people. They hadn't waited for the formal notification. They were already inside. The guard at Ashford's entry, who had let 6 exhausted riders through the gate 8 minutes ago, was not, Caspian now understood, the only person who had received instructions tonight. He looked at the corridor. 6 men, armed. Moving with professional coordination, not violence yet, but the organized pressure of force about to be applied. And at their center, in the gray pre-dawn light coming through the corridor's high windows, walking with the measured pace of a man who owns the institutional ground under his feet and intends to demonstrate it, Deputy Chancellor Harwick. He was older than Caspian expected, 60, maybe more. A compact man with a scholar's frame and eyes that moved through the room with the same rapid inventory that Celine's did, the same trained assessment, the same quality of calibration. He looked at the assembled group in Ashford's study, Caspian, Adrian, Ivana, Celine, the 3 council members, Ashford herself, and he took in all of it in 2 seconds, and he did not look surprised by any of it. He looked at Caspian. "Impressive," he said. Not sarcastic. Genuine. The acknowledgement of a man who respects a competent opponent without intending to let that respect change the outcome. "Adrian Vale," he continued, looking at the Duke. "You're named in a formal containment order. I'd like you to come with me quietly." Adrian looked at Harwick. Then he looked at Caspian. Then, and this was the moment, the one that everything had been moving toward, the one that couldn't be undone. Adrian Vale looked at the desk where Celine's 23 pages lay in front of Lady Ashford and the 3 council members who were watching every person in this room with the attention of people who understood that what they were witnessing was not something that would happen twice. He looked at Harwick. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Harwick held his gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at his 6 men. "Take him." They moved. And Caspian Vale, standing in the study doorway, with his father in front of him and his mother at his shoulder and the dawn breaking outside the high windows, made the last decision of the night, which was no decision at all, which was simply the thing that was true. He was not going to let them through. He put himself in the doorway. He looked at the 6 men coming down the corridor and felt the pulse in his chest and the cold air on his face and the 23 pages behind him on the desk. And he thought about 3 dead men in an ambushed convoy and 31 years of hollow ground and 11 months of watching his family absorb damage that was still, even now, still arriving. He thought about what you became when there was nothing left to lose. He thought, this is what it looks like. "If you want him," Caspian said, "you'll have to go through me." Harwick stopped. The 6 men stopped. The corridor went silent except for the sound of boots on stone going still and the pre-dawn light coming through the high windows, and somewhere beneath it all, the specific silence of a moment where everything that follows is about to be determined by what happens in the next 4 seconds. Harwick looked at Caspian Vale in the doorway. Caspian looked back and did not move. 4 seconds. That was how long Harwick held the standoff. 4 seconds in the gray pre-dawn light of Ashford's corridor, with 6 armed men behind him and Caspian Vale in the doorway, and the 23 pages on the desk behind Caspian, and 3 council members watching everything with the attention of people who understood that what they were witnessing was already, in some irrevocable sense, on the record. Then Lady Maren Ashford spoke. She did not raise her voice. She had the particular quality of authority that had stopped needing volume several decades ago. "Deputy Chancellor," she said from behind the desk, "this session was convened 40 minutes ago under Article 12 of the Council's emergency review provision. You are standing in an active council proceeding. The men behind you are standing in an active council proceeding." A pause. "Any action taken in this room in the next 60 seconds will be documented as interference with an Imperial judicial session. I'd like you to understand that clearly before you decide what to do next." Harwick looked at her. Ashford looked back. 70 years old, gray hair, dressing gown. The gaze of a woman who had outlasted 4 deputy chancellors and intended to outlast a 5th. The 6 men behind Harwick did not move. Harwick looked at Caspian, then at Adrian, visible over Caspian's shoulder, then at Celine, who was standing near the window with the particular stillness of a person who has been in rooms like this before and knows which way they break. He looked back at Ashford. Something moved in his face. Not defeat, not yet. Something more precise than that. The expression of a man recalculating in real time, running the variables forward, and finding that the path he came in with has produced a result he wasn't modeling at 4 in the morning when he gave the order to move. "This proceeding," he said carefully, "was not properly—" "It was convened in accordance with Article 12, said the female council member to Ashford's left, the one with the bearing of someone who'd made hard decisions before. Her voice was flat and uninterested in his objection. "The provision requires 2 sitting council members and the chair. We are 3 and the chair. The proceeding is proper." Harwick was silent. "Furthermore," Ashford said, "the documentation presented in this session implicates the Deputy Chancellor's office in a pattern of intelligence compromise spanning 8 years. The council members present have reviewed this material and voted 3-0 to advance it to full council review under emergency session protocols." She looked at him. "Your containment order is procedurally subordinate to a council emergency session. I think you know that." The corridor held its silence. Caspian felt the moment shift, felt it the way you feel a structural change, not in any single visible thing, but in the aggregate of everything at once. The 6 men behind Harwick had gone from forward momentum to a held position that was trying very hard not to look like uncertainty. Harwick himself had the expression of a man who had been 3 moves ahead for 8 years and had just found someone on the board who'd been counting his moves. Harwick looked at Caspian. "You built this in 2 weeks, he said. "My son built it," Adrian said from behind Caspian's shoulder, "while I was otherwise occupied." Harwick was quiet for a long moment. Then he said to his men, "Wait outside." They went. Harwick walked into the study alone. He sat down, not invited, not waiting for invitation, the habit of a man who had treated rooms as his own for long enough that the habit had become structural. He looked at the 23 pages on the desk. He looked at Celine. "You burned 8 years, he said to her. Not with anger, with the flat assessment of someone calculating the operational loss. "You were going to burn me in 6 weeks, she said. "I chose my timing. You chose poorly." "I chose to still be alive," she said. "I'll take poorly over the alternative." Harwick looked at the council members, at Ashford, at the documentation spread in front of them. He was doing, Caspian understood, the final calculation, the one where you assessed whether any remaining move improved your position or whether the board had gone past the point where your position was improvable and you were only deciding what the loss looked like. He sat with that for 30 seconds. Then, "I'll want arrangements." "You're not in a position to negotiate arrangements," Ashford said. "Everyone is in a position to negotiate arrangements," Harwick said. "The question is what they're worth." He looked at her directly. "I have knowledge of 3 additional foreign operations currently active against Imperial noble houses. Names, methods, current status, the kind of knowledge that would take your intelligence office 2 years to develop independently." He paused. "That has value." Ashford looked at the two council members. The calculation took 4 seconds. "We'll discuss it," she said, "after you've surrendered the containment order and recalled your people from the Vale household." Harwick looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his coat, produced a document, and placed it on the desk beside the 23 pages. He stood up. He walked to the door. At the threshold, he stopped and looked back. At the room, at everyone in it, at the specific arrangement of people and documents that had ended 8 years of patient work before dawn on a Tuesday. He looked at Caspian last. "Your profile said you were methodical," he said. "It didn't say you were fast." "The profile was outdated," Caspian said. Harwick left. The room breathed. What followed was institutional rather than dramatic. The particular grinding machinery of formal proceedings, documentation chains, council notifications, and the administrative infrastructure of holding a deputy chancellor accountable in a system that had been designed, in part, by that same deputy chancellor to make such accountability difficult. It took weeks. It was not clean. It was not the ending that stories shaped themselves toward. But it held. The documentation held. Ashford held. The 3 council members held, and brought 4 more with them when the full session convened. And Harwick's network inside the Imperial apparatus unraveled with the particular speed of structures that have been held together by a single load-bearing point. When the point gave, everything that depended on it followed. Lord Aldrich was named in the secondary proceedings. He resigned his advisory position before the formal charges could be filed, which was the move of a man who understood exactly what the documentation contained and was trying to control the shape of his departure. He was not fully successful. Nobody in this situation was fully successful. Celine Marrow, the name that wasn't a name, provided testimony under the arrangement that Ashford negotiated, and the 3 active foreign operations that Harwick had offered as currency turned out to be, on examination, accurate and significant, which meant her cooperation produced concrete value that the Imperial Intelligence Office could not ignore regardless of what they thought about the source. She received, in the end, a form of protected status that was less than amnesty and more than prosecution, the unglamorous middle ground that pragmatic institutions arrived at when the alternative cost more than it was worth. She left the capital 6 weeks after the council session. Caspian did not see her go. He received a note 2 days after she left in an envelope with no return address. The note contained 1 line. "You were faster than the model." He read it twice, put it in the secure correspondence drawer. Did not reply. There was no address to reply to. Adrian Vale relinquished his title on a Wednesday morning in late autumn, in a council chamber that was mostly empty because Ashford had arranged it that way, understanding, without being told, that a man surrendering 30 years of institutional identity deserved to do it without an audience treating it as a performance. The formal process took 11 minutes. Afterward, Adrian sat in the anteroom outside the chamber for a long time without moving. The anteroom had old furniture and a window that faced north, and the light coming through it was the flat gray of overcast autumn, the kind that made the world look like a document that hadn't been finished. Caspian sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. "It feels," Adrian said finally, "like something lifted." Caspian looked at him. "I thought it would feel like, I don't know, amputation." He looked at his hands. "It doesn't." "What does it feel like?" Adrian was quiet for a moment. "Like I put something down that I'd been carrying too long and didn't notice how heavy it was until I put it down." He paused. "That probably sounds like something a man tells himself to make a loss acceptable." "Maybe," Caspian said, "or maybe both things are true." Adrian looked at him. "I owe you," he said, not with the performed gravity of a formal acknowledgement, with the stripped-down quality of a man saying the thing he meant, without ceremony. "Not just for this, for the months before this, for holding what I left." Caspian was quiet. There were things he could have said, true things, about the weight of those months, the specific exhaustion of holding a structure together while watching the person who built it dismantle it in real time, about the anger that had lived in him through all of it, that had not dissolved but had transformed, become fuel and then structure and then something else. something that didn't have a clean name yet. He looked at his father. "Don't owe me," he said. "Just be present. That's what it actually costs." Adrian held his gaze for a long moment. "That's more than it sounds," he said. "Yes," Caspian said. "It is." Ivana received Adrian back at Ironfield on a Friday, 3 days after the title relinquishment. She did not make a ceremony of it. She was in the East sitting room when he arrived. She had, in the months of his absence, established that room as hers in a way that the manor had simply accepted, the way spaces accept the people who occupy them with sufficient authority. And she looked up when he came through the door and said, "There's tea," which was not a welcome and was not a dismissal. It was an offer of the ordinary, which was, between two people who had survived the extraordinary together, more than it sounded. He sat down. He had tea. They were together in the room for an hour before either of them spoke about anything that mattered. And what they spoke about then was not recrimination and was not forgiveness in the formal sense. It was something more honest than either. The specific conversation between two people who have known each other for 30 years and have decided, without announcement, that the knowing is the thing that persists. Not unchanged, not unbruised, persisting. "I don't have language for what I did," Adrian said. "I've been trying to find it. There isn't language that covers the actual shape of it." Ivana looked at her tea. "No," she said. "There isn't." "Then what do I—" "You stop looking for language," she said. "And you stay. That's what you do. You stay, and you're present, and you do the work of being where you are." She looked at him directly. "Not because it earns anything back. There's no transaction here, because it's what you are if you're actually what you're claiming to be." Adrian was quiet. "And if I can't, then we'll know," she said. "But we don't know yet. So stay." He stayed. Dad. Darren, who had been 14 when he watched his father's carriage roll south from Ironfield's East Gate, was 15 by the time the proceedings concluded and the household settled into whatever it was going to be going forward. He did not ask his father for an explanation. He had the same quality of silence about him that Ivana had, the deep water kind, where what moved was moving below the surface and would emerge on its own terms. 3 weeks after Adrian came back to Ironfield, Darren came to the weapons room while his father was there. Adrian was not training. He was doing what Caspian had been doing during those months, working through forms to give his hands something to do while his mind processed what resisted more direct processing. He looked up when Darren came in. Darren leaned against the doorframe. "Caspian says you were good," he said. "At the end, during the Ashford thing." Adrian set down the practice blade. "Caspian was generous," he said. "Caspian doesn't do generous," Darren said. "He does accurate. There's a difference." He looked at his father with his mother's eyes, the deep water quality, the assessment that didn't announce itself. "I'm not ready to... I don't know what I'm ready for yet." "I know," Adrian said, "but I'm not leaving." Adrian looked at his youngest son, 15 years old and already carrying the particular composure of a person who has absorbed more than his age was supposed to require and has made the decision, somewhere in the private interior, to carry it without complaint. "I know," Adrian said again. "Thank you." Darren pushed off the doorframe and went. Adrian stood in the weapons room for a long time after. He thought about what it cost a boy that age to say, "I'm not leaving," to have to say it at all, to live in a house where that statement was necessary because its opposite had been, for 11 months, the operational default, to have to name the staying because the leaving had been so visible. He thought about the 31 years Hendrik had stood in these halls, in this room, possibly, and moved through the household's days with the invisible authority of long tenure while the household's information moved outward through him like blood through a cut that nobody knew to look for. He thought about all the structures he had believed in because they were old enough that questioning them had stopped occurring to him. He thought about what it meant to build your certainty on things you hadn't examined in years. He thought about Celine, not with longing, not with the compound feeling that had, in its time, been strong enough to pull him out of his own life, with something quieter than that, the specific consideration you gave to something that had cost you enormously and from which you had not walked away without understanding something true. He had not been a fool, exactly. He had been a man who needed something and had not been honest enough with himself about what that need was, and someone very skilled had recognized that need and stepped into it with precision. The failure was not in the wanting, it was in the refusing to examine what he wanted and why. The failure was in choosing the explanation that felt like freedom over the evidence that suggested something more complicated. What he had wanted, at its actual core, was to be seen without the performance, to have the machine switched off, and to still be recognizable. That was not an ignoble want. It was, in fact, a very human one. What was ignoble was that he had looked for it in the wrong direction, away from the people who had known him long enough that the performance had worn thin instead of toward them. Ivana had seen him without the machine. She had always seen him without the machine. He had been so busy performing for her that he had stopped noticing when she stopped requiring the performance. That was the actual loss. The rest? The title, the influence, the institutional identity? That was the accounting. The actual loss was the decade of mornings he had spent in the same house as the person who knew him best, and had not, for reasons that made no sense to him now, looked directly at that and called it what it was. He could not get that back. Some things, once understood too late, stayed too late. What you did with that understanding, what you built from the wreckage of it, that was the only question left. And 6 months after the council proceedings concluded, Caspian Vale was appointed to lead the newly restructured Imperial Intelligence Review Commission, the body established in the wake of Harwick's network to audit the intelligence apparatus and rebuild its oversight architecture. It was not a glamorous position. It was a position that required patience, institutional knowledge, and a tolerance for the grinding work of reform that happened mostly out of sight. 3 people turned it down before it was offered to him. He accepted on a Tuesday afternoon in Ashford's study, at the same desk where the 23 pages had changed the geometry of the empire. Ashford watched him sign the appointment papers. "You understand," she said, "that this will take years." "I understand." "And that the people you're auditing will not be cooperative." "I understand that too." She looked at him for a moment. "You're not going to find this satisfying day to day. Reform work never is. It's plumbing. Nobody appreciates good plumbing until something goes wrong." "I know," he said. "I grew up in a house with bad plumbing." He set down the pen. "I know what it costs." She looked at him with the specific quality she reserved for statements that earned her full attention. Then she nodded once. "Good," she said. "Then go to work." Adrian Vale's name disappeared from the capital's formal record over the following months, in the gradual way that names disappeared when they were no longer attached to offices, not erased, but no longer summoned. He lived at Ironfield. He worked the estate's land management, which had been neglected during the months of crisis and required sustained attention, the kind of slow, physical work that had no political dimension and no audience, and produced results only in the long term. He was not good at it at first. He had spent 30 years at the level of institutional strategy and had to rebuild, from the ground up, the capacity for work that required patience with small increments. He built it. Ivana watched him build it with the particular quality of attention she gave things that mattered, present, unannounced, not narrated. One evening in late spring, 8 months after the title relinquishment, they were in the garden at Ironfield, the kitchen garden, not the formal one, the functional space where things grew because they were needed, rather than because they were decorative. And Adrian was doing something with the fence line that had been broken since autumn. He was not doing it well. He was doing it. Ivana came out with 2 cups of something hot and sat on the low wall at the garden's edge and handed him one when he stopped to rest. He sat beside her. The evening light was the long gold variety that came in late spring when the days had extended past what winter had trained you to expect. The kind of light that made familiar things look briefly like themselves from a different angle. "Caspian's report comes out next month," Ivana said. "I know, he told me. He's going to name 12 additional compromised positions in the apparatus." "I know. He told me that too." Adrian looked at his hands. The fence work had roughened them in a way that the last 30 years hadn't. "He calls me now. Did you know that? Every week or so. Not about anything in particular. Just calls." Ivana was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I knew." "You knew?" He's been doing it for 4 months. She looked at the garden. He doesn't know I know. Does it bother you? That my son calls his father? She looked at him sideways with the expression she deployed for questions that were slightly below the required intelligence of the conversation. No, Adrian, it doesn't bother me. He was quiet. I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say, he said. You've been trying to say it for 8 months. I know. It doesn't need to be said, she said. I know what it is. You know what it is. She picked up her cup. The saying isn't the part that matters. He looked at her. The staying, he said. The staying, she agreed. The garden held its evening quiet around them, the particular hush of a working space at rest, the smell of turned earth and spring growth, and the warm stone of the low wall they were sitting on, which had been part of Ironfield's structure for longer than either of them had been alive. Longer than the title, longer than the institutional architecture that had been built and compromised and rebuilt in the months just past. The stone was still there, the garden was still there. Some things persisted not because they were defended, but because they were at their foundation simply solid, because they had been built correctly in the first place, and the building had been honest and the material had been real. Adrian thought about the silver ring on his hand, the one his father had given him, that he had left on an entry table and retrieved in some moment he still couldn't fully account for, some intermediate hour when the machine had stopped running long enough for the actual person to reach for the thing that meant the actual person. He thought about what it meant to have been, at one's core, worth the reaching. Not the title, not the function, the thing underneath. He thought, I nearly destroyed this. He thought, it is still here. He thought, that is not a comfort exactly. It is a responsibility. The most demanding kind, the kind that doesn't come with instructions or a fixed endpoint, the kind that simply continues, requiring you to continue with it, day after day after day, in the patient accumulation of ordinary presence that was the only currency that actually held its value. He had 30 years of ordinary presence ahead of him, if he was fortunate. He intended to spend them correctly. He looked at Ivana beside him on the low wall with the evening light on her face and the garden at its spring abundance around them, and he did not say anything. She did not say anything. The light moved slowly across the garden the way light moved in late spring, unhurried, golden, unaware of the winter it had followed. They sat in it. They stayed. The name Celine Marrow appeared in no subsequent Imperial record. The intelligence office's files on the individual operating under that designation were classified at a level that made them effectively invisible to everyone except the people with the specific clearance to access them, and those people did not discuss what they found there. What remained in the public record was the 23 pages, or rather, the summary of the 23 pages that had been entered into the Council's formal proceedings, in which the operative was referred to by her operation designation rather than her name. A name that wasn't a name. A person who had moved through 8 years of other people's lives with the particular quality of something that leaves marks without leaving presence. The way water shapes stone. Not by force, but by persistence. By the long application of something that seems harmless until it has changed the shape of everything around it. Caspian thought about her occasionally, in the specific way you thought about something that had altered the course of events you were still living inside. Not with warmth, not with hostility. With the particular consideration you extended to something that had been genuinely formidable and had, in the end, chosen a side that served its own survival, which was, he recognized, more honest than a great many people managed. The note stayed in the secure correspondence drawer. He did not open it again, but he did not throw it away. Darren Vale, who had been 14 at the window, who had watched a carriage roll south and made the decision not to call out because he'd learned that calling out produced nothing useful. Darren was 17 when the Empire finished its slow recovery, and he was studying under 3 different tutors and carrying himself with the particular quality that Caspian recognized as his own quality, but warmer, less armored. The benefit of having watched the armor fail at close range, and having decided, based on that evidence, to build something different. He came to Caspian's office at the commission one afternoon in early summer, an unannounced visit, the family habit, and sat across the desk and said, I want to understand what you do. Caspian looked at his brother. Why? Because it matters. Darren looked at him with their mother's eyes and their father's jaw, and something that was entirely his own. The quality of a person who had decided very young to pay full attention and had been paying it ever since. Someone has to do it after you. I want to know if it's something I can do. Caspian studied him for a moment. Then he pulled a chair around to Darren's side of the desk. Move over, he said. I'll show you. Darren moved over. Caspian showed him. Outside, the capital went about its summer afternoon, carts and foot traffic, in the long light of a season that had followed a hard winter and knew nothing about the cost of the warmth it was providing. The Commission's work continued, page by page, name by name, the slow structural repair of an apparatus that had been compromised at its foundations and needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, with attention to every layer. It was plumbing, as Ashford had said. It was the most important work there was. Inside the office, two brothers bent over a desk in the late afternoon light, and the older one explained the architecture of what needed to be done, and the younger one listened with the full quality of his attention, and neither of them noted the significance of the moment, because significance, in their family, had stopped requiring ceremony. It simply was. It continued.